Hey there. Tonight, we're exploring why you wouldn't last a day as a Pony Express rider. Not the Hollywood version you know. Just hushed, moonlit relays, swapping horses every 10 miles while the schedule, the cold, and the mail never let up. If these stories help you unwind, I'd love a quick like or subscribe, but only if they're genuinely working for you. I'm curious where in the world you're listening from, so drop your location and local time in the comments. It's amazing seeing our little community span the globe through these historical tales. Now settle in, maybe turn on some white noise, or grab your favorite blanket, and let's drift into tonight's story together. You take the job that no sane airhair department would post. The year is 1860. Your new employer promises $100 to $150 a month, which sounds generous until you read the fine print. 900 plus miles of wilderness, 10 days coast to coast, ride day and night, switch horses every 10 to 15 miles, and weigh no more than a sack of potatoes, because every pound slows the mail. The company calls it the Pony Express. You call it a dare from the universe. You look around St. Joseph, Missouri, where this whole experiment begins. A railroad has finally reached the Missouri River, the Hannibal and St. Joseph line, and telegraph wires stop here like a road that ends at a cliff. That gap is your job. You're the human bridge, the living algorithm that shuttles information across a continent that hasn't decided if it wants to come together yet. It isn't a romantic cavalry parade. It's a sprint. The leather contraption they hand you is called a mochila, Spanish for little bag, though the load feels anything but little. It's a thick leather apron with 4 lockable pouches draped over a light saddle. The genius is speed. At stations, the entire mochila lifts off one saddle and drops onto another in seconds. No time for buckles, no time for pleasantries. You ride, you swap, you vanish. The company, Central Overland California and Pikes Peak Express, run by the firm of Russell, Majors and Waddell, has planted roughly 190 stations from St. Joseph to Sacramento. Swing stations every 10 to 15 miles for fresh horses. Home stations every 75 to 100 miles for fresh you. In theory, you nap at the home station. In practice, sleep is an optional, unprofitable technology. You look the part because the part is engineered around you. They want light riders. Thin, wiry, under 125 pounds. If possible, the mochila can carry about 20 pounds of letters, plus a few pounds of special telegram printouts, and you're expected to carry the bare minimum of gear: a water bag, if you're lucky, a small Colt revolver, if you insist, maybe a knife. No rifle, unless you hate speed. Saddle, bridle, spurs, leather leggings, and the sense that a paycheck can defeat physics. Every ounce matters. Every ounce harms the horse. The route is a geography teacher's fever dream. You leave the steamboat landings of St. Joseph, cross the Missouri River, into Kansas Territory, angle up through Nebraska along the Platte River, past Fort Kearny, roll into the emptiness toward Julesburg, Fort Laramie, and South Pass in the Rocky Mountains. You skim past Fort Bridger, down into Salt Lake City, across the salt flats and mountains of the Great Basin, in what is now western Utah and Nevada, past lonely names like Egan Canyon, Roberts Creek, and Sand Springs, then through Carson Sink, onto Genoa and Placerville in the Sierra foothills, over the Granite Spine, and down to Sacramento, where a river steamer completes the journey to San Francisco, about 1,966 miles. according to the mapping used by the National Park Service, and not a single mile of it cares how much your legs burn. You feel fast because you are fast. The schedule the company brags about is 10 days, as in 10 days from the Mississippi River's edge to California's capital. Some runs beat that. When the mail carried the text of Abraham Lincoln's inaugural address in March 1861, the westbound trip was made in around 7 days and 17 hours. A line of horses and teenagers outran everything else America had built. The point lands. You are not just riding. You are the entire West's progress narrative, condensed into sweat and hooves. The brand name lies to you in a charming way. You are not riding ponies. You are riding horses bred for speed and stamina. Smallish Mustangs, half thoroughbreds, California-bred racers around 14 to 15 hands. Pony in the name sells the idea of quickness. Pony in the saddle would sell you into a ditch. Your animals are trained to launch, like a slingshot, the instant your boots find the stirrups. Your first mile feels like being fired from a cannon. That feeling repeats every 10 to 15 miles, again and again, across a continent. The pay looks strong on paper, $100 to $150 per month, when a skilled laborer might scrape together 30 to 40. It is hazard pay. Napoleonic wages for information warfare. The mail rate is obscene, because it has to be. $5 per half ounce at the start, roughly the cost of a decent suit of clothes in 1860. Later dropped to $1 and then lower as volume and partnerships shift. Wells Fargo sells stamps for special legs, newspapers contract for speed, and the company hemorrhages money anyway. Historians put the losses around $200,000 over its 18-month life. Even your heroic mile splits can't cover the burn rate. The myth that drifts into your ear before you mount the first horse is the famous job ad, the one supposedly reading, "Wanted young, skinny, wiry fellows, not over 18, must be expert riders willing to risk death daily. Orphans, preferred." It is perfect, which is exactly the problem. It is probably a myth. No contemporary 1860 newspaper advertisement has been found with that exact wording. Historian Christopher Corbett, who titled his book Orphans Preferred on purpose, hates how elegantly false it is. The line survived because it fits the vibe, and because later showmen like William F. Cody replayed it for applause. Reality is less theatrical and more bureaucratic. The company hired riders who met the weight and rider skill requirements, mostly late teens and 20s. Some older, and it did not put preference for orphans in ink. The job was dangerous, and the company needed living employees more than a tragic aesthetic. You mount anyway. The first time your horse shoots forward, the wind stings like an insult. The first station is barely a promise on the horizon. The plan is simple. Lean forward, save the animal by letting it run its pace, and let your mind memorize the shape of the trail. You get to the swing station, and the world becomes a drill. A stable hand grabs the bit. Someone else lifts the mochila. Another hand slaps it onto the waiting saddle, and a manager shouts times, distances, and curses. You move before your brain catches up. 30 seconds later, your next horse is already at a gallop, and you are trying not to fly off. No ceremony, only transfer speed. You cannot make this slower, because the man behind you will not make it slower, and neither will the one behind him. All the way to the Sierra, you imagine clean lines of ownership and male authority, and immediately learn that the route is a patchwork. Military forts act as security islands. Home stations are often someone's rough cabin, or an adobe square with a palisade. Some stations are immaculate, with a blacksmith, grain, remounts, and a cook who cares. Others are hungry, damaged or abandoned. You stand in the doorway of a Nevada station with a sign of life no stronger than a cooling fire pit, and understand why the company told you to keep moving unless you must stop. The longer you stand still, the more the frontier takes interest in your breathing. The company does have rules, distinct mailbags, seals, carried letters sorted by pouch location, so you do not waste seconds hunting for a mid-route delivery at a stop. Speed outranks comfort. Comfort outranks heroics. Firearms come last because they weigh something, and because the best defense you have is still the animal under you. The company gave moral advice too. No endorsing whiskey on duty. No gambling precious minutes at stations. No leaving the trail. Russell, Majors and Waddell were pious men. Delivering sermons about behavior was as important to them as delivering envelopes. Then the environment explains the real rule. It's not the job that tries to kill you. It's the land. Nebraska's Platte River Valley at dawn sells you a calm you did not order. The Great Plains lull you, level as certainty. Then a thunderstorm slams the earth like a door. Lightning turns the horizon into a cracked mirror. You are wet. The mail is not allowed to be wet, and you are figuring out how to be a sponge and a roof at the same time. The wind hits sideways, and your horse leans into it like a sailor against a gale. Dust storms ride in uninvited. When the trail edges a bluff, crosswinds become a physics exam. You pass only by not moving. You have no vortices, chart, no federal weather warnings, no radar, just a sky you read like a hostile note. Your schedule does not respect night. You ride in darkness more than you ride in sunlight. New moon nights turn the road invisible. Stars provide navigation if your brain has capacity left to look up. Your horse knows the trail, which is good because your concentration is a frayed rope. You learn to trust the animal. You also learn to talk to yourself without words, because you are not allowed the indulgence of imagining voices in the dark. The mail is heavier when it's quiet. Mark Twain, in his 1872 travel memoir Roughing It, saw a Pony Express rider flash past a stagecoach and wrote a description that people still quote. He wrote of a phantom, a brown blur, a passing exclamation mark on a prairie sentence. That is you in the eyes of any traveler on the overland trail. Here and gone. No conversation. The public sees you and files you under legend. Your lungs file you under manual labor. Then Nevada arrives and calls your bluff. The Great Basin is bad comedy. On one side lies Salt Lake City, with Mormon communities and the relative comfort of supply. On the other side lies the Sierra, with trees and streams and towns that feel like they have a future. In between sits silence, baked into alkali flats and empty mountain basins. Sand Springs in Nevada is one of those stations that creates nightmares by existing. The ground crunches. The water tastes like sorrow and minerals when there is water at all. Your horse's hooves sound too loud. Coyotes practice their networking. The trail skims the edges of dry lakes, like the Carson Sink. Ride too far off the line, and your animal sinks to the fetlocks in powder and salt. Keep the pace, and your throat collects a dry. That coffee cannot help. Pyramid Lake and the mountains near it look beautiful until you remember that beauty does not filter arrows, bullets, or grudges. In May 1860, a conflict now called the Pyramid Lake War broke out when white station keepers at Williams Station reportedly abducted 2 Paiute women. Retaliation followed, and then a cycle of violence spiraled into pitched battles between Paiute bands and hastily organized militia from nearby settlements. Several Pony Express stations were attacked and burned. Station men and riders killed. The mail service suspended parts of its route for weeks. Contractors improvised, rerouting, consolidating, or simply waiting for armed escorts. This isn't a frontier fairy tale. This land had nations before the Pony Express, and those nations defended themselves when assaulted. You ride through the aftermath of power, property, and rage colliding because a business plan tried to occupy an existing world. When a company pamphlet says only one mail was ever lost, it sells a story. It is not the full account. Letters burned in station fires. Motulus went missing in chaos. The record can honor speed and still admit loss. Against that backdrop, your job description gets revised on the fly. Robert Pony Bob Haslam, a rider whose route ran through this Nevada hellscape, made a legendary run in May 1860 during the height of the Pyramid Lake War. According to his later accounts and company records, he covered roughly 380 miles in less than 40 hours because other riders and stations were out of action and the mail could not wait. He crossed the same line multiple times, outran attackers, took an arrow that punctured his jaw, and still kept moving. This is not a scriptwriter's exaggeration. It is a documented endurance feat at the edge of human capacity. You put yourself in that saddle and feel everything in your body negotiate with the concept of quitting. Your pay stub doesn't include a bonus for carrying puncture wounds. Your options are forward or regret. Other riders carried their own brutal resumes. Jack Keatley reportedly did a run of over 300 miles without a full sleep break and finished with his face so wind-burned and cracked that he bled when he smiled. Johnny Fry, often named as the first westbound rider to leave St. Joseph on April 3rd, 1860, sprinted into history with a mochila loaded with newspaper dispatches that would be old news by the time they crossed the Sierra, unless he and every rider after him carved minutes off the road. William Buffalo Bill Cody became the most famous name attached to the Pony Express. But fame is not a bibliography. He was 14 in 1860, and while he may have ridden some short relief runs, the sweeping claims in his later autobiographies and stage shows contradict surviving company records. The scholar consensus from the Smithsonian, the Buffalo Bill Center of the West, and historians who read payrolls and station logs is blunt. Cody's legend sells tickets. Your job requires a horse and a timetable, not a brass band. You notice a pattern. The Pony Express runs on precision and myth at the same time, but they serve different masters. Precision belongs to the station keepers and stock tenders who live in the middle of nowhere, feed your horses, maintain your gear, and sometimes defend the place with their lives. Without them, you do not leave one station and arrive at the next on a predictable schedule. Myth belongs to the marketing department. Wells Fargo issues fancy stamps. Newspapers publish valiant travel times. Poster art paints riders in hero light. The truth that matters to you is feed, grain, water, and a manager who knows the schedule for your remounts down to the minute. Feed the horses and the line hums. Fail to feed the horses and time breaks. Your remounts matter, and so do the saddles. The saddle of choice is something like a stripped-down McClellan prototype. Light, narrow, designed for quick swapping. A mochila draped over anything else wouldn't work. You develop a relationship with the sound of the pouch hitting the leather, the thud that tells you the next sprint has already started. The fact that you hear it in your sleep is not a romantic detail. It's how your brain memorizes shock. You hear talk about rules against swearing and drink, the piety of Russell and Majors, the company oath not to mistreat animals and to fulfill your duty. You also hear nothing about OSHA, because OSHA does not exist. If you go down on the trail, help is a hope. Military posts will bury a rider when they find one. Trails are marked by bones as much as by signs. Your hydration plan is brutal minimalism. Water, when there is water. That means the Platte and the Sweetwater are heaven. Means small springs in Utah are lifelines with names. Station keepers whisper. It means the alkaline wells in Nevada are a dare your stomach takes because it must. One of the driest legs is the stretch between stations, like salt wells, sand springs, and cold springs. The names sound like jokes written by someone with a dark sense of humor. Sand Springs is a seep you wouldn't rinse your hands in if you had any other option. You drink carefully. Your horse drinks carefully. You taste the land in your spit for hours. Then the Sierras show up and redefine difficulty. On the eastern side you climb. You cross passes like Luther Pass or Echo Summit, depending on the year and adjustments. Snow can swallow a road overnight. The winter of 1860-61 hit riders with drifts and ice. You ride into trees taller than ambition. And remember that the steeper the climb, the slower a heart pushes blood to muscles. Your horse breathes steam you can feel on your boot. At the crest, the world lifts and light changes. Downhill into Placerville, then to Sacramento. The names turn from survival to commerce. Breweries, newspapers, and warehouses appear. Civilization congratulates itself on speed and convenience. You have salt on your lips and a clock in your teeth. The distance you cover per shift sounds small in decimals and enormous in sinew. 75 to 100 miles for a rider, a dozen or more horse changes, 10 days total end to end if all goes well. The math says you see help every hour or so. The reality says you live alone in the intervals between stations. The worst day rides longer than the math. Even on a good day, you carry weight that isn't leather. The letters themselves are odd. Cargo. Some are business. Some are family news. Some contain money. Many are newspapers printed on thin paper to shave ounces. Newspapers buy Pony Express service because they sell speed to their readers. Your mochila sometimes carries tiny dispatches from the telegraph back east, printed and condensed so California sees national politics, elections, and in 1861. The precise movement of a country that used to be singular. When the Civil War starts in April 1861, the riders carry news that no one can pretend is local anymore. You literally deliver the end of one America and the first iteration of another. You pause and notice an absurd but important detail. The mail's weight limit meant something for how people wrote. No elaborately thick letters, no indulgent pamphlets, ingenious printing on thin paper. America learned to talk fast and light when speed demanded it. A technology constraint enhanced brevity. Consider it a 19th century lesson in Twitter before electricity. On a granular level, you do not last because your body is not designed for this kind of repetition. Legs cramp, lower back spasms, skin cracks, windburn flays lips. Your hearing turns tunnel-like after hours of hoofbeats. You self-diagnose with terms like saddle sore, chafe, exhaustion, dehydration, and winter lung, which is not a medical term, but should be. The job stresses joints, brains, and common sense. The invisible harm is sleep deficit. The line demands riders at midnight and 2 a.m. and 4 a.m. And the only difference between those hours is the star arrangement. You try to hide the fear and keep your pace steady because you've noticed two facts that matter. 1. Predators of any kind dislike fast-moving, noisy targets with company in a minute. 2. The trail does not care about your fear. Neither do your bosses. They hire you to make speed a habit and courage a routine. The job is a sprint, yes, but the sprint repeats. The accumulation is what breaks people. The government never gave the Pony Express a long-term contract, and the company owner's plan, despite press pry, was always to prove the route's viability for an overland stage and telegraph corridor. The plan almost worked quickly enough. The telegraph line snaked westward, along portions of your path. Professional crews dug holes, planted poles, strung wire. Towns and forts grew around the line, because the line made culture. On October 24th, 1861, the first transcontinental telegraph messages sipped between San Francisco and the east. On October 26th, 1861, the Pony Express announced it was shutting down. The service had lasted about 18 months, April 3rd, 1860, to October 26th, 1861. Long enough to capture imaginations and short enough to be remembered as an intense spark. The numbers give you a weird kind of applause. Around 80 riders at any time, maybe 400 to 500 horses in rotation, about 190 stations across the route, roughly 35,000 letters delivered in total. Depending on the tally you prefer from the Postal Museum and the National Park Service, the company set up the entire corridor in a handful of months, buying horses, hiring riders, contracting station keepers, and creating a logistics chain that makes modern companies nod in respect. You see why the story metastasized into legend. It compresses a country's appetite for motion into one single line of dirt. The myth police part of your brain wants to relabel a few persistent posters. The famous ad is doubtful. The claim that a single mochila never went missing is false. The image of constant battles with native peoples ignores long stretches of relative calm, negotiated passage, and the fact that the most intense violence in 1860 Nevada had specific causes and consequences, not some vague frontier chaos. The idea that Buffalo Bill Cody was a primary rider is entertainment. The belief that the riders were all teenage daredevils ignores older men who rode because they could, and because a feed station needed a sub, and because a schedule demanded a departure. The insistence that the Pony Express was profitable is a joke the balance sheet does not tell. The legend is useful for feeling. The data is useful for truth. You would not last a day if the clock started at the first horse and ran to the 100th mile. You would not last if the day included the worst storm on the Platte and the driest station in Nevada and a Sierra Pass buried in an angry cloud. You would not last if you handled one of the runs that broke lesser riders, but you would also not last for smaller reasons that pile up like debt, a torn boot, a lame horse because someone in a remote station underfed him, because a supply wagon broke an axle in a river you did not see, a cold that becomes something worse, a fly into your eye at a gallop that makes you blink at the wrong time near a ravine. Survival often comes down to details you cannot control. Concede that, and the mystique shifts from hero worship to infrastructure admiration. The underwear of the operation, stock tenders, smiths, station keepers, cooks, deserve an entire museum wing. Without them, you ride an animal that fails at mile 11 and you die at mile 14. Some lived with their families at lonely posts, raising children within bullseye distance of violence and weather. Some were killed during the 1860 conflict in Nevada. Their names appear in scattered records and local markers. You ride past their graves and remember that a corporation's ambition becomes a person's everyday risk. Even before the telegraph killed the need, the economics ran on fumes. The $5 per half-ounce fee they started with is outrageous in 1860 terms, roughly the equivalent of triple-digit dollars today. They cut the price to $2, and then $1 to stimulate demand. And because competitors and partnerships forced it, that earned goodwill, not profits. The endeavor was a tech demo for speed in a political statement about the United States' ability to bind its coasts with information. The coming of the telegraph proved Demo's thesis and erased its margins. Stories about your speed survive because they lived in newspapers that prolonged their own importance by bragging about the Pony Express. Terms like 1,966 miles in 10 days sound like a marketing department making math sexy. That math works. You do not cheat it with gasoline or paved roads. You cheat it with planning, with a line of barns in the middle of nowhere, with food for animals, where animals have no business thriving. That planning actually holds up to modern scrutiny. Tech companies talk about scaling. The Pony Express scaled in months, matched its schedule, and then produced a graceful exit when a better technology arrived. The owners lost money. America gained muscle memory for coast-to-coast communication. Your appetite for romance has not disappeared, but it now lives alongside specific names and dates. April 3rd, 1860. First rides leave St. 60. Joseph and Sacramento. Johnny Fry leaves St. Joseph with the first westbound mail packet. Harry Roth or William Sam Hamilton, depending on which source you prefer, carries the first eastbound out of California. November 7th, 1860. A famous westbound run carries news of Abraham Lincoln's election, beating the clock that would have made the news stale. March 1861. Lincoln's inaugural address hits the trail, and the run hits 7 days and change. May-June 1860. Pyramid Lake War disrupts the route and rewrites lives. October 24th, 1861. The telegraph crosses the Sierra. October 26th, 1861. The company announces the end, and the sound of hoofbeats as data becomes nostalgia. The visuals you keep are sharper than the slogans. A rider's silhouette against a thunderhead. The leather of a mochila dark with oil and sweat. The carbon black of a station's cook fire at dawn. The ruin of a burned-out station in Nevada, folding into the desert, almost as if it never existed. The gold and blue of a Sierra morning when the only thing that matters is that the horse likes the trail as much as you do. The way a station tender's hand pats a horse's neck as if to apologize for the speed demanded by men on paper. You keep the sourcing honest because the story deserves it. The National Park Service's Pony Express National Historic Trail provides route maps, station sites, and numbers that ground how far and fast. The Smithsonian Postal Museum catalogues the stamps, the fees, and the sheer weirdness of an 18-month service that lives forever in American identity. Christopher Corbett's book, Orphans Preferred, untangles the myths and explains why some lies survive, because they feel perfect. Company histories in Wells Fargo's archives explain the business rationalization and the red ink that bought the nation's favorite adrenaline story. Rider memoirs, Pony Bob Haslam's among them, fill in the parts that official ledgers do not record, like what it felt like to stitch a jaw wound on the move with resolve instead of thread. You look back at the job description and the part where they didn't mention bears, or flood-swollen river crossings, or the simple hazard of a prairie dog hole at speed. On a good day, a prairie dog is a fun wildlife note. At a gallop, a prairie dog hole is a catapult. Your horse breaks a leg, and the entire world becomes triage, and you are not a veterinarian. And the nearest help is a station 2 horses away. You remember why many riders carried a single pistol and said a small prayer they never had to use it for mercy. You evaluate your kit the way a modern cyclist obsesses over grams. Revolver or faster climb, heavy coat or faster horse, extra water or shorter breath. Every station becomes a small debate about ounces. Ounces become minutes. Minutes become history. When correspondents in San Francisco print something you carried days earlier from the Mississippi River, you feel the economy of weight translated into the currency of news. The but wait parts are the ones that hook people because they feel like reveals in a heist movie. But wait, ponies were horses. But wait, the job ad was theatrical and probably invented later. But wait, Buffalo Bill was more showman than schedule keeper here. But wait, only around 35,000 letters made the trip. But wait, the company lost money to make a point. But wait, the Telegraph took the baton the minute it could. Each reveal does the same thing. It strips away the cosplay and leaves behind the engineering. You stare at the NP's maps and the distances between Egan Canyon Station and the Ruby Valley stations and get a physical reaction, because now you've tasted those miles. Egan Canyon's notch cuts through the Shell Creek Range like someone carved a proof of loneliness into rock. Ruby Valley is gentler, a long basin with grass that horses actually like. The relief you feel when you see a station roof in the distance is so sharp it almost hurts. The relief is not dramatic. It is bodily. Station equals water. Station equals less risk. Station equals a human voice that can read your face and decide to hand you food anyway. History gives you receipts for almost every part of the job. The number of stations, the distance between them, the schedule for riders, the speed of certain runs, the fees for letters, the wages paid. The parts without receipts, the exact text of a ridership oath, the total number of lost mochilas, the specific day-to-day hazards of each mile. Your best sources are diaries, memoirs, trail logs, and newspapers. Some shrink the story. Some inflate it. The modern consensus respects the stunt scale and the human cost without awarding everyone sainthood. You also see how the Pony Express transformed landscapes plotted by others. Military expeditions, like John C. Fremont's mapping, immigrant wagon trains carving the California Trail, the Mormon Exodus defining a corridor. Those are the baseline. The Pony Express doubled down on a route that was already America's nervous system. Supply roads got better. Stations became waypoints for livestock and migrants. When the telegraph wire went up, it followed the easiest path lines found by people who preceded you. Your job used what others learned and left behind infrastructure for those who came next. The West builds in layers. You know why the story stuck. It collapses national campaigns and broken treaties and immigrant hopes and military garrisons and a modern economy's earliest impulses into one kid riding across the horizon. It feels like a chosen hero fable, so it markets itself. And yet the more you stand inside it, the more the fable melts and the process remains. The process is the heart. A rider gets on a horse, launches, and is gone. 30 seconds. Then the next. Then the next. Over and over until San Francisco's readers understand who won the presidency or whether their cousin made it to Carson City alive. That is why a telegraph wire appearing on a ridgeline is an act of mercy, not betrayal. The wire says the process can speed up with less blood. You run the day again in your head and start to make a list of the precise reasons you would fail early. The first sprint goes too hard because you have something to prove and because adrenaline is dumb. You burn out in 20 miles and limp into the third station at a canter, already behind the clock. Your hands blister under the reins because the leather is drier than you wanted and because you gripped instead of holding. The blisters open and your fingers weep against sweat and dirt. Infection is a future complication you nod to and do nothing about because there is nothing to do. Food becomes an afterthought. A crust of bread, a bite of jerky, coffee if someone has grounds. You miss calories, and underestimate how your body pays you back with dizziness. You pair that dizziness with a night descent and set yourself up for a slip that costs 3 minutes. 3 minutes multiplies across the line in humiliation. The station where you expected a fresh horse has none, because a previous rider had to use it. The tender explains with a tired shrug. He looks like he has been awake for 2 days. He says he will have a horse in 2 hours. You analyze 2 choices. Wait, or take a half-fed animal that might die under you. You wait, because you want to sleep more than you want to be a murderer. The delay eats half your schedule, and you hate everyone, especially yourself. A river crossing rises with overnight rain. The ford is now a swirl. Your horse can swim, but swimming, with tack and rider, is not running. You unsnap, you strip what you can to lighten the load, and you attempt. It works, and it also feels like a dare no one warned you about. Your mail survives because the mochila is a designed masterpiece, with heavy leather that resists soaking. You survive because your boot found the bottom at the right footfall. A station cook feeds you something that tastes like the compromise between beans and soap. You miss home food you do not have. You ride with heartburn you call a new frontier experience. A rider ahead of you whispers that riders carry pistols for a reason, and you realize how thin your margin is if people want what you carry. You ride faster to outrun every story you've heard, real or embellished, and in so doing become the story someone else will repeat, because they saw a pony rider flash by like an omen. And yet the same reason you wouldn't last a day is the reason those who did matter so much. The job pushes humans to the limit of what a single endurance day looks like. It tests the chain so the chain can be proven stronger in the next iteration. Telegraph lines are built while you ride. The route you keep open, long enough to justify investment, is the route investors upgrade. The speed you dream about becomes reality with copper wire. You take a final inventory of the myths that cling even after the wire goes up. Myth: the Pony Express outlived the telegraph. False: the company shut down 2 days after line completion, acknowledging reality faster than some modern businesses. Myth: riders died constantly. Exaggerated: some died, and riders faced lethal hazards. But many riders survived and lived into old age, trading terror for stories and memorabilia. Myth: every rider was a boy orphan. False: young men dominated, yes, but the range included older riders, and the hiring policy was speed and skill, not theatrical tragedy. Myth: letters always arrived in exactly 10 days. That's the goal. Reality varied by weather, conflict, and team strength. Myth: Buffalo Bill's Pony Express career was exactly what his show said it was. The payrolls and records say otherwise. The story deserves your affection because it earns it with specifics. April 3rd, 1860 to October 26, 1861. Saint Joseph to Sacramento, roughly 1,966 miles, around 190 stations. Swing stations 10-15 miles apart. Home stations every 75-100. Mochila weight around 20 pounds of mail. Rider weight under 125 pounds, if possible. Wages around $100, $150 per month. Initial postage $5 per half ounce, later reduced. Fastest famous run, carrying President Lincoln's inaugural address to California in about 7 days and 17 hours. Major disruption during the Pyramid Lake War, May-June 1860. Closure with finality when the telegraph completed on October 24th and the service ended on October 26th, 1861. Company losses around $200,000. depending on the accounting you accept. These numbers pull you out of anecdote and into understanding. You can feel how quickly the United States learned to care about what you carried. Before the Pony Express, California news crawled by ship around Cape Horn or by the Panama route, a journey of weeks. The Express compressed that into days. Newspapers built front pages around your schedule. Men at telegraph keys in the east hammered out dispatches that would meet you in St. Joseph in time for the next rider to bolt west. The country's conversation sped up, and the gap between coasts started to shrink in minds before it shrank in geography. You are a short hinge on a large door. The weight of the door is beyond you. The hinge matters anyway. Personal tastes aside, you also recognize how the Pony Express sits in a continuum of risky jobs people did before safety nets were even a thought. Deep-sea whalers, coal miners, canal diggers, railroad laborers in the Sierras blasting granite with hand drills and nitroglycerin, telegraph line crews stringing wire across canyons, stagecoach drivers taking bullets with their passengers' money on board. Risk was not a side effect. Risk was on the job description. They all earned their myths the same way, by doing something that lasted just long enough to change the next thing. You mop your forehead and think about how the cactus-scented West, the alkali flats, the horse sweat, and the leather smells became willfully nostalgic once people stopped dying to cross them. The stagecoach became quaint after the railroad made it irrelevant. The Pony Express became heroic after the telegraph made horseflesh feel obsolete. That's the easiest trick memory plays. It sweetens what it no longer has to endure. So you finish your shift and hand the mochila to the next rider the way hundreds did. And you try not to collapse just because someone else is launching. The station man looks at you with the expression of someone who has seen the same triumph and exhaustion every 3 days for months. He pours coffee that smells like burnt rope. He asks nothing. You tell him less. He knows the math. Your hands still shake. That's normal. He knows the schedule. You leave the saddle with a body that has become a map of the route, imprinted with the angles of every climb and the shape of every ford, and then you confess the hard truth. You would not last a day. That's not a failure of character. It's a recognition of the design. The Pony Express took a nation's ambition, condensed it into pure physical demand, and ran it to the breaking point on purpose. It was supposed to be hard. It had to be unsustainable. The point was not to build a permanent courier service on horseback. The point was to prove that the information gap was a solvable problem, and to stake a claim on the corridor where the solution would live. You look one more time at the details that deserve to be stuck in your head like a burr. A rider mounting in St. Joseph in April 1860, with the town gathered to watch. A town that understood the first run was a performance for the ages. A first mochila, arriving in Sacramento with a crowd that celebrated punctuality like a son returning from war. The telegraph in October 1861, wires humming with news that no horse will carry anymore. A company ledger with red numbers, a trail dotted with graves, some marked, some not. The ghost of a kid named Pony Bob, whose face you can't see but whose ride you can feel. Stations like Sand Springs, reduced to stones, and ghost scratches for modern hikers to post on social media and call haunted, because the air there keeps more silence than human voices like mine ever will. You place the Pony Express where it belongs, in the exact middle of reality and myth, where numbers back up the awe, and awe makes the numbers fun to say. You salute the riders without pretending you are one of them. You admire the horses without calling them ponies. You give the station keepers more credit than they were given then. You let the Pyramid Lake War complicate a story that would be cleaner if everyone stood politely aside. You give the telegraph its victory lap. You understand why modern endurance athletes smile when they hear the mileage. Why logistics nerds trace the stations on Google Earth in reverent boredom. Why school kids draw horses with lightning bolts and mailbags on their backs. You step away from the saddle with one last dry laugh about that perfect job ad. Orphans preferred, expert riders, death daily. It survives because it feels true. History gets better when you hold on to what actually is true. Skilled, light riders, expert stock tenders, a leather mochila you could swap faster than you can form an opinion. 7 days and 17 hours for a continent-crossing speed run, with a president's words in the pouches, somewhere between 80 and 100 riders making the line live. At any moment, around 190 stations, 10 days on paper, 18 months in life, one wire to end it. You wouldn't last a day, which is exactly why the people who did are worth remembering by name, by mile marker, and by the numbers they hit under conditions you would not choose on a dare. You put the story back on the shelf differently than you found it. Less cowboy poster, more logistics miracle. Less orphan myth, more station ledger. Less wild boast, more measured achievement. You walk away with dust in your mouth and a fact in your pocket. And the fact is simple. When speed mattered, the Pony Express made the West feel smaller by making riders feel infinite for a few hours at a time. And then it stopped, right on schedule, because the next machine could do it without anyone bleeding into the saddle. Next, let's turn our attention to the architectural marvels of ancient Mesopotamia. It starts with a lie that refuses to die. The most famous garden in the ancient world smells like wet myth. The bluest gate in history is basically a chemically engineered flex. And the tallest thing on the skyline is a giant, staged mud brick mountain that isn't a pyramid and never tried to be. Ancient Mesopotamia built architecture that still hacks the modern brain. And it did it with river mud, reed bundles, and black goo scooped from the ground like nature's hot glue. Here's the setup. Between the Tigris and Euphrates, people had limitless silt and nearly no stone. No granite quarries, no endless forests for beams. Just sun, clay, reeds, and bitumen bubbling out near places like Hit in Iraq. The ingredients list reads like survival mode, not luxury mode. Yet by 3,200 bars, the city of Uruk was punching out monuments in a new style of urban swagger. Monumental mud brick platforms, temples with zigzagging approaches, cone mosaic walls that sparkled, and a perimeter wall so massive that later legend handed the credit to Gilgamesh, because regular humans apparently needed a demigod to explain that much brick. The early playbook goes like this. Build with mud bricks shaped in a wooden mold, dry them in the sun, and stack in staggering numbers. Temples and platforms swallowed bricks by the hundreds of thousands. To keep walls from melting in the rainy season, tuck reed mats between courses like ancient house insulation. Slather bitumen as waterproof mortar. Import cedar from Lebanon for long roof spans when the budget allowed. Without marble for fancy cladding, invent a deep blue glaze and turn baked brick into an art form. Inventiveness by necessity. And it works like an algorithm. Scarce materials plus relentless repetition equals architecture with presence. Uruk sets the tone. In the Anna precinct, temples get decorated with thousands of small, colored clay cones hammered into wet plaster to create geometric patterns. These cone mosaics date to the 4th millennium BC, and archaeology digs have counted them in the tens of thousands. each cone roughly 10 to 15 centimeters long. The look is audacious. A pixelated wall beaming red, black, and white patterns at a time when most of the world is still figuring out villages. It's the earliest version of a wall saying stop scrolling and pay attention. At the Anu Ziggurat, on the opposite rise of Uruk, a temple known as the White Temple sits on a platform roughly 13 meters high. The temple's plan forces a bent-axis approach, meaning worshippers pivot around a corner and never get a straight hero's march toward the altar. This is architecture as choreography. A planned turn that builds suspense and power. A stage-managed journey invented thousands of years before museum curators started funneling crowds toward the gift shop. City-making follows hard behind temple-making. Uruk's walls ran roughly 9 to 10 kilometers around the city, encircling more than 5 square kilometers of streets and courtyards. That is dense. Population estimates sit in the tens of thousands by 3,000 bes, with some scholars pushing toward 40,000 or more. The streets are narrow, wandering, and deeply pragmatic in a scorching climate. Houses cluster around inner courtyards, rooms opening inward for privacy and shade. Many houses add a second story. Wooden beams and reed mats carry roofs. Plaster smooths everything and drains snake under the floors. Archaeologists at sites like Nippur and Eshnunna have found baked brick drainage channels and vertical clay pipe vents serving toilets by the early 2nd millennium bar. The modern brain calls that indoor plumbing. Mesopotamia calls it Tuesday. A building revolution lands around 2100 bes, and it still stands in the desert with a posture that refuses to slouch. At King Namu and his successor Shulgi build a ziggurat that defines the skyline then and now. The base measures roughly 64 by 46 meters. 3 monumental staircases climb the facade and meet at a gate halfway up, like a ceremonial intersection of ramps. The present height is around 21 meters after modern restorations. But with the long-lost temple on top, the original would have reached closer to 30 meters. Mud brick fills the core. Fired bricks armor the exterior. Bitumen locks it together. Buttresses carve dramatic shadows into the facade. Bricks stamped with Namu's name testify to royal quality control, the ancient version of a CEO signing the beams. The ziggurat's name, Etameniguru, often translated along the lines of house whose foundation creates terror, sets the vibe, splendor with an edge, a building that startles before it instructs. A ziggurat is not a pyramid, and never tries to be. It is a terraced platform, a stepped mountain with a stairway ritual baked into its geometry. It anchors a temple complex, not a tomb. It's oriented toward the cardinal directions and engineered for visibility across a flat floodplain. It is also an urban strategy. Climb it, and the city's canals, courtyards, and market squares lay out like a map. Step off it, and the ziggurat remains in the peripheral vision of everyone crossing the city, an optical spine that says the gods have prime real estate, and the king knows a good site plan. Temple campuses multiply across the south. Nippur's Iker, the House of the Mountain, lives as a perpetual site plan under renovation. Each rebuilding phase adds layers, new walls wrapping old foundations, mud brick slowly becoming a stratigraphy of dynasties. At Lagash, the Gudea statues brag in stone about building plans, foundations rituals, and measuring rods. The inscriptions read like a project manager's kick-off meeting, and scholars love them specifically because they sound like work. Purify the brick mold, stretch the measuring line, dedicate the foundation deposits. The ritual is as technical as it is spiritual. A merged field where surveying, scheduling, and sacrifice share a checklist. The domestic scale never stops experimenting. In houses, the courtyard remains the center, but it's more than a light well. It's a thermal engine. Hot air rises and vents. Heavy walls release coolness at night. Narrow lanes shade the ground. Without air conditioning or glass windows, design does the heavy lifting. The same principle scales up. Temples and palaces use vast courtyards for airflow and processions. Wing walls and buttresses break up long exteriors, cutting wind pressure and creating shadow. Meanwhile, the rivers complicate everything in the best and worst ways. The Tigris and Euphrates deliver silt, water, and trade. They also flood, shift channels, and turn fields into swamps if the canals get clogged. Mesopotamian cities become project managers of moving water. Canals extend like streets, and levees guard fields with a farmer's paranoia. The cuneiform record includes contracts for cleaning canals and fines for letting irrigation channels silt up. This is architecture that never gets to retire. Every flood season is maintenance season. Every dynasty is a renovation crew. The materials science stays humble and quietly genius. Mud brick is the star. Standardization scales it. Over centuries, brick dimensions stabilize into ratios like 1:3 for thickness, width, and length. The with 33 by 33 centimeters for faces, with thickness around 7 to 10 centimeters. Fired bricks step in for damp zones, drains, and decorative facades. Bitumen from natural seeps near the Euphrates city of hit sticks, seals, and waterproofs. Reed bundles weave rooftops and doors. Stone arrives from far away when necessary. Limestone from the desert, basalt in small quantities, and alabaster for palace sculpture in the Assyrian north where empire budgets can handle it. There's a territorial texture to Mesopotamian architecture, a gradient from reed and mud in the marshes to mud and brick in the south to mud and stone in the north. The map prints itself on the buildings. Across this landscape, an innovation hums quietly that modern narratives misfile. Arches and vaults do not belong exclusively to Rome. In Mesopotamia, brick arches roll over drains and doorways by the early 2nd millennium BES. At Nippur, archaeologists catalogue baked brick barrel vaults built to keep sewage channels from collapsing. The engineers use wedge-shaped bricks to form the curve. Gravity does the rest. The arch keeps the load in compression and hides in the infrastructure like a backstage miracle. When Roman engineers later throw arches across aqueduct valleys in stone, they're performing a trick that has been solving soggy alleys in brick for centuries. Then the stage shifts north, and everything scales up. The Neo-Assyrian kings in the 9th to 7th centuries build palaces that function like government headquarters, propaganda arenas, and wildlife documentaries carved on walls. At Kalu, Nimrud, Ashurnasirpal around 879 Bruce, completes the northwest palace, with rooms opening off ritual courtyards and long reception halls paved in gypsum slabs. Monolithic guardian figures called Lamassu stand at gateways with 5 legs each, so they look still from the front and striding from the side. Each one weighs multiple tons and stands well over 4 meters high. Moving them requires logistics, sledges and teams, hauling on ropes. Reliefs line the walls in strips almost 2 meters high, engraved with texts and scenes of war, hunting, and ritual. The palace is architecture, plus narrative, plus intimidation. The stone is local gypsum. The design vocabulary is centuries old. The scale is new. Sargon II goes one louder. In 717 Bas, he breaks ground on a brand new capital at Dershirukin, now Khorsabad. The city plan is almost a perfect square, with 7 monumental gates, some named for gods. The citadel perches in a corner of the wall like a fortified VIP lounge. Palaces and temples share terrace platforms. The walls bristle with towers. The city's geometry is a manifesto. Grids and axes take over where the south once wove meandering streets. Orthogonal planning enters the room and points at the map with a ruler. The capital barely survives Sargon's death in 705 Bes before politics moves the court to Nineveh. But the idea doesn't die. Mesopotamian cities can bend toward plan. They don't have to stay organic. Nineveh becomes the mega-project. Sennacherib builds what he calls a palace without rival, and then makes good on the name. The palace includes more than 80 rooms, with thousands of square meters of carved reliefs. The city walls run roughly 12 kilometers, dotted with about 15 gates. Sennacherib reworks the water system with a canal network stretching dozens of kilometers from mountain sources. At Jarawan, he builds a stone aqueduct with inscribed limestone blocks and waterproof bitumen, an engineering statement that needed cut stone, carpenters, and stonecutters working in sync. Scholars date that aqueduct to around 690 BC and call it one of the earliest known large-scale stone aqueducts. He is not improvising with puddles. He is staging a hydraulic ballet for a city on a rise. A modern twist arrives here that scrambles world wonder lists. The hanging gardens get top billing in ancient tour guides, but no Babylonian cuneiform text unambiguously describes them in Babylon. Greek writers talk, centuries later, about a terraced garden with plants growing on vaulted platforms. Excavations in Babylon haven't turned up the smoking gun. Meanwhile, Sennacherib's inscriptions at Nineveh openly brag about a terraced garden watered by a canal network and a new device for lifting water. Later, Greek writers credit the water screw to Archimedes in the 3rd century Bas, but Sennacherib, writing before that, claims a machine that sounds suspiciously similar. British Assyriologist Stephanie Daly stacks text against text and relief against relief and argues that the famous garden may have stood at Nineveh, not Babylon, making it an Assyrian showpiece along that canal fed by the Jarawan aqueduct. A wonder for all peoples, his own inscription calls it. That phrase is not architecture speak. That is a billboard. In the south, though, a different billboard still glows. Babylon's Ishtar Gate, built by Nebuchadnezzar II around 575 BC, is the world's most lethal case of irresistible blue. The color is not paint. It is a copper-rich glaze fused into baked bricks in kilns that had to hold temperature with precision. The assembled gates soared more than a dozen meters high. Glazed relief, animals stride across it. Bulls for Adad, the storm god, and long-necked, snake-tailed dragons called Mushfushu for Marduk. The processional way leading to the gate stretches for hundreds of meters, its glazed lions marching in serial glory. Some counts tally around 120 lions along that route, each lion over 2 meters long, while the gate and adjoining walls host scores more bulls and dragons in rows. The bricks carry cuneiform inscriptions, naming Nebuchadnezzar as the builder. Robert Coldewey excavated the gate's foundations between 1899 and 1917 and hauled enough glazed bricks to Berlin to rebuild part of it at the Pergamon Museum. The reconstructed gate stands about 14 meters tall in the museum space, and it is a humbling exhibit in color science, even after 2,600 years. Babylon is a building site with an attention span equal to its ambition. The city's monumental platform for the Marduk temple complex anchors a ziggurat called Etemenenki, the temple that later feeds the Tower of Babel story. Herodotus in the 5th century BC writes wildly about Babylon's walls and towers, tossing out dimensions that look like they were measured with adjectives. He says the city walls are so thick, chariots could ride on them side by side. He inflates the circumference to comic book scale. Archaeology counters with more grounded numbers. Babylon's inner walls likely ran under 20 kilometers around the core, with multiple defensive circuits and moats, and the main walls were thick and tall, but not mythical highways. Etemenenki's base measured around 91 by 91 meters, according to excavated foundations and later records, and its height is estimated anywhere between 60 and 90 meters, depending on reconstruction, which is still terrifyingly high for stacked clay. Nebuchadnezzar, too, rebuilt it. Alexander the Great later planned to rebuild it again and ordered the site cleared. The tower is real. The Babel is the retellings. The baked brick glaze technique at Babylon is as much chemistry as art. Copper-based pigments produced the signature blue. Yellow glaze likely came from iron compounds. Black from manganese. Firing bricks evenly required controlled kilns. Numbers matter. A brick measures roughly 30 to 35 centimeters per side in these Neo-Babylonian contexts, and the formed reliefs require molds and careful stacking. The walls pop because the artists refuse to settle. Relief animals are not painted flat after construction. They are part of the brick fabric itself. This is not surface decoration. This is structural color. Between the Assyrian stone and Babylonian glaze runs a single thread that makes Mesopotamian architecture weirdly modern. Everything is a system. The ziggurat is not a standalone. It's the exclamation point at the end of a campus. The palace is not just a throne room. It's a bureaucratic machine with storage rooms, scribal rooms, archives, and courtyards lined up for ceremony. The processional way is not a road. It's a theatrical corridor for festival parades in the spring during the Akitu New Year, connecting the Esagila Temple of Marduk to the city gate and beyond. And the humble house is not just sleeping quarters. It's a climate strategy, a family workshop, and a privacy plan wrapped into one. Mari, an older city on the Euphrates near modern Syria, shows that palaces system centuries before the Assyrians scale it with stone. The palace of Zimri Lim, in the early 18th century Bars, sprawls over nearly 2.5 hectares, with more than 260 rooms. The plan is a maze with logic. Courts for public ritual near the entrance, administrative suites tucked deeper inside, private rooms deeper still. There's a throne room with wall paintings, among them the famous investiture of Zimri Lim mural, executed in bright mineral pigments on plaster. Drains run under floors. Storage rooms line corridors. The archives cough up thousands of tablets, including letters that sound like real humans complaining about supplies, climate, and political headaches. Architecture and administration feed each other, room by labeled room. If the Mesopotamian city looks like an organism, the ziggurat is the spine, and the canals are the arteries. Temples soak up agricultural surplus in offerings and redistribute it through feasts and wages. Canals bring water to barley fields and bricks to job sites. Kings hang plaques on walls that say, "I built this." But the lines are clear. It takes a whole city to raise a tower. The priestly class manages the calendar and the rituals. Scribes manage the numbers. Craftsmen shape bricks and wood. Farmers deliver grain that pays the wages. When disaster strikes, flood, fire, invasion, the rebuilding is almost default. Faith and practicality write the same to-do list. This pragmatic side is where Mesopotamian architecture slips into daily genius. Consider the oven, the door, and the roof. Ovens go into courtyards for ventilation. Doors pivot on stone sockets to keep the wood dry and the threshold strong. Roofs use palm trunks or imported timbers laid across walls, topped with reed mats and thick mud plaster, which insulates against heat and keeps rooms cool if the plaster is maintained. Occasionally a bit of vaulting sneaks into domestic storage rooms to create cooler, more secure spaces. Utility drives form. There is also a fascination with thresholds that speaks fluently in brick. Gatehouses multiply walls and create spaces within spaces. City gates at Nineveh carry names like Mashki Gate and Nergal Gate, and some include internal guardrooms, multiple vaulted passages, and defensive platforms. The famous Nergal Gate housed a pair of Lamassu for centuries, until modern war dug them up again. The Mashki Gate, rebuilt in modern times to celebrate heritage, suffered in recent conflicts and is now under careful restoration. These layers of breaking and rebuilding mirror the ancient cycle. Mesopotamian architecture was always resilient in a fragile way. Mud brick dissolves in a few seasons, without care, which forces a culture of constant renewal. A collapsed wall is not a scandal. It is a memo. Replace the bricks. Stamp the new ones with the new king's name. Reset the cycle. Nothing captures this better than the foundation deposit. Builders bury objects, copper figurines, inscribed tablets, cones with inscriptions, under corners and thresholds. They do it for the gods, but also for future excavators. A foundation cone stamped with a ruler's name is both a ritual and a permanent receipt. When modern archaeologists pull them out and read the Sumerian or Akkadian inscriptions, Namu built this. Gudea dedicated that. The history of a construction project lights up with dates, sponsors, and intention. Those dates matter. Urbanization in southern Mesopotamia is well underway by 3500 B. Writing coalesces around 3200 BICE in the Uruk period, with pictographic tablets that will evolve into cuneiform. The Akkadian Empire of Sargon, around 2334 to 2154, Besh shifts the political map northward. The third dynasty of or to 2 from 2112 to 2004 B standardizes bricks, measurements, tax receipts, and ziggurats with corporate energy. The Old Babylonian period brings Hammurabi to the stage around 1792-1750 B. His stele is sculpture, yes, but the architectural ripple shows up in how building contracts and property laws are recorded, with clarity that would make a modern city planner nod. The Kassites later rebuild and rename. Centuries pass, empires move like weather. By the 9th century BCE, Assyria is building in stone, and by the 6th century BCE, Babylon is glazing in neon. The beating heart is constant. The material palette is not. When the audience wants a tech angle, the math drops in with a wink. Mesopotamia's base 60 system, the sexagesimal math behind minutes and seconds, shows up in survey lines and ground plans. Bricks line up in repeating ratios. Planners lay out buildings by measuring rods and chords. For cardinal alignment, surveyors use simple astronomical observations, the rising and settings of stars, to orient ziggurats and walls. It isn't mysticism. It is field science, often written down. Bricks carry inscription, stamps. Tablets record inventory and plans. Lists enumerate door leaves and column bases. In some building accounts from the R3 period, scribes calculate quantities of bitumen, and reeds needed, a ledger that doubles as a punch list. The myth-busting is part of the fun because the myths are delicious. The hanging gardens have already been rerouted. The Tower of Babel is not a vanity by a single tyrant. but a long-running urban project with rebuilds under multiple kings, including Nebuchadnezzar II, and later interest by Alexander, who never finished the job. The Romans did not invent the arch or the urban apartment. Mesopotamians built brick vaults over drains centuries earlier and stacked multi-story houses around courtyards with wooden stairways tucked into tight corners. The Greeks did not start monumental painted architecture. The sun flashing off conical mosaics at Uruk and the saturated glaze on Babylonian walls did that job long before Greek temples got their colors back in modern reconstructions. Even the oft-repeated idea that Mesopotamia is a featureless plain misses the point. The architecture manufactures topography on purpose. Platforms, terraces, and towers create hills where none exist. The skyline is artificial and proud of it. Archaeology adds plot twists that rival any streaming miniseries. Paul Emil Botta, in 1843, launches modern Assyrian archaeology with discoveries at Khorsabad. Austin Henry Layard in the 1840s and 50s uncovers Nineveh and Nimrud and ships Lamassu to London, prompting Victorian newspapers to print sketches of monstrous winged bulls that looked like ancient deepfakes. Robert Coldewey spends nearly 2 decades at Babylon documenting walls and foundations with a precision that late imperial Germany loved. Leonard Woolley digs at in the 1920s and 30s, clearing the ziggurat and uncovering the royal tombs, whose construction pits and vaults are more likely to be corbelled than truly arched, but still testify to brick innovation under pressure. The British Museum and Iraqi teams in the 20th and 21st centuries compile plans for palaces, gates, and temples with drones, photogrammetry, and old-school hand measurement. Every new trench complicates the story. Every conservation effort adds a footnote about modern intervention that future historians will also need to read. Then modern war rolls through and smashes heritage with a reckless hand. The Northwest Palace at Nimrud suffers destruction in 2015. Lamassu reduced to dust by sledgehammers on camera. The Mosul Museum gets vandalized. ISIS bulldoze parts of ancient Nineveh, but the story refuses to end on a wrecking ball. Iraqi archaeologists and international teams rebuild sites like the Mashki Gate at Nineveh and stabilize the ziggurat of Ur's embankment. New laws guard what old laws missed. The cycle continues. Mesopotamian architecture is used to being rebuilt. There is a pattern in this architecture that feels startlingly candid. Mesopotamian cities put the sacred on high platforms and feed it with the labor of the many. Palaces annex the sacred next door and domesticate it with corridors of bureaucracy. Gates ritualize entry. Courtyards, corridors, assemblies. Streets braid the mess of daily life into something that breathes with the weather. The whole system refuses to hide the work. Brick faces show their bond patterns. Buttresses show where the load meets the wall. Glazed bricks shout their recipe. Reliefs on palace walls overshare the king's life and career in sequences that stretch for kilometers of carved stone. It is architectural transparency without modern glass. The climate is a silent collaborator, and the details bear that out. Mud plaster needs annual recoating before winter rains. Flat roofs need retamping and smoothing. Heat cracks plaster. Winter moisture swells it. Sun-baked bricks shrink and settle, so walls lean and crack. Builders know the symptoms and the fixes. There are records of temple repair campaigns after floods, with kings listing how many bricks they laid. Nabonidus, in the 6th century BC documents, his restoration of Ur's ziggurat and other temples with a self-satisfaction that sounds like a press release. He names old kings to prove continuity. He lists materials to prove resources. The texts are architecture's warranty card, Urban scale keeps flexing across centuries because politics never sits still. Cities rise, fall, and revive. Nineveh disappears under earth for 2 millennia, while its name lives in scripture and myth. Babylon gets reoccupied by empires and abandoned again. Dries out, refloods, and finally becomes an archaeological tell. The architectural achievements hold on through this churn because they are so numerous. Thousands of buildings, millions of bricks, incised names on enough units to make archaeologists grin when they read a royal title in reverse, on a thumb-sized stamp. One of the quiet stars of the story is simply the human habit of stamping. Bricks under Ur's ziggurat bear the stamp of Ur-Nummu in cuneiform. Baked bricks at Babylon stamped with Nebuchadnezzar's name pop up across the city. These stamps often include short formulas: the king, the patron deity, the verb build, and the building's name. Thus, the etymology link is not a guessing game. It's a labeled photograph in reverse. Every stamp is a data point. Every layer of bitumen under a wall is a date range. Even the foundation deposits, with little copper figurines representing builders and surveyors, turn into miniature footnotes in the dirt. Another quiet star is risk management. Mesopotamian builders invent structural redundancy centuries before engineers start writing treatises with equations, buttresses and pilasters. Those vertical projections on long walls are not decoration. They keep long mud brick walls standing by, breaking up the spans. In gatehouses, multiple passages reduce the blast damage from battering rams long before the phrase blast damage exists. In drains, vaulting prevents collapse and keeps the city from smelling like a test of faith. In canals, gates and weirs regulate flow because the Euphrates does not care about timetables. The glitzy details keep pulling the eye back. Those cone mosaics at Uruk glittered because the clay cones were sometimes painted with slips that fired to a sheen, and the patterning created visual rhythms. The White Temple's whitewashed plaster would have thrown back the sun with a brilliant glare. The ziggurat of Ur's bitumen black bands and brick red masses create a bold, striped look in reconstructions. The Ishtar gates lapis-like blue nails, a color psychology that still sells luxury goods in the 21st century. Color isn't an afterthought in Mesopotamia. It is a structural element in the message. The gods deserve color and shine. The city deserves walls that look alive. Infighting with Egypt in art history textbooks over whose monuments are cooler misses the point. The two traditions tackle different problems. Egypt builds in stone along a rock-rich Nile with a stable flood cycle. Mesopotamia builds with mud in a floodplain whose rivers shift course like bored snakes. Egypt aims at eternity, chiseling hard stone for a climate that respects limestone. Mesopotamia accepts ruin and implements recreation as policy. The Old Kingdom Pyramid Christmas versus the ever-renewed ziggurat might be the best comparative lecture never needed. Both hit their targets. Mesopotamia just baked Waterloo-level contingency planning into the bricks. What survives is revealing. The palaces and city walls in the Assyrian north survive because they are in stone and because they were reburied by neglect and chance. The glazed bricks at Babylon survive because the glaze fused to the clay and because Koldewey had the budget to rebuild a gate in Berlin. The ziggurats survive as mounds because the core is massive. Domestic quarters survive in plan because walls were thick and foundations go down deep. What doesn't survive keeps showing up in writing and reliefs. Painted beams, textiles, banners, gardens, so the mental reconstruction always needs a push past bare brick. In reliefs from Sennacherib's palace showing gardens, bunched trees, and terraces, the green returns. In the investiture painting at Mari, a colour field fills a formal moment of kingship. Walls never stood in monochrome for long. There's one more curveball that deserves airtime. The marshes of southern Iraq sustain a reed architecture that descends from deep antiquity. Today's mud-hiff guest halls are built with bundled reed arches rising in tall barrels, fronted by facades with zigzag matting. Step back a few thousand years, and the painted clay models from Sumer show curved reed-roofed huts and shrines with bundles tied together, doorways arched by bending reeds into ribs. This is architecture at renewable energy speed. It grows in a season and stands in a storm. If lashed well, bitumen seals the footings. The design language of those reed structures bleeds into brick architecture as recurrence. Curved openings, arch forms, and barrel roofs find cousins in baked brick, where budgets and contexts call for permanence. The legal framework pulls its weight too. Tablet archives record the obligations of teams working on walls. Old Babylonian letters complain about missing timber deliveries. Neo-Assyrian inscriptions threaten curses if future kings neglect repairs. The Code of Hammurabi lists penalties for faulty construction that causes collapse, including the legendary clause that if a builder's work kills the owner, the builder faces death. Scholars debate which clauses were applied and how often, but the top-line message remains savage. Competence is not optional, so the marvels stack up. Ziggurats at Uruk, Eridu, and Babylon. The Ishtar Gate and Processional Way. The grid and gates of Dur-Sharrukin. The palace without rival at Nineveh. Canal systems with aqueducts at Jewon. The palace maze at Mari. City walls that make metaphors unnecessary. Drains and arches that keep everything livable. House courtyard, plans that modern architects lift, tweak, and call timeless. Glazes that still hijack attention spans. Brick stamps and foundation cones that make archaeology feel like a document archive. And an entire civilization that decided buildings should be overtly, obviously, sometimes aggressively meaningful. No fantasy needed. No invented dialogue. The bricks speak. A quick reframing of scale helps lock it in. When a king orders a ziggurat, he isn't inventing it from scratch. He is continuing a practice that traces back to the Ruk and Ubaid habit of elevating temples. When Nebuchadnezzar orders the Ishtar Gate glazed, he is plugging into centuries of fired brick experiments and taking them to the highest heat. When Sennacherib builds stone aqueducts, he's applying arch and vault knowledge to water at empire scale. The marvels are not flukes. They are the visible tip of a long curve of iterative building and relentless maintenance. Many modern cities accidentally repeat Mesopotamian patterns. Public buildings dominate high points and big intersections. Gateways and arches get turned into symbols and backdrops. Plazas do thermal work and ceremonial work at the same time. Water infrastructure sits underground until it breaks and then suddenly becomes headline material. Building codes grow fangs after disasters. Developers put their names on cornerstones with a century's worth of pride stuffed into a few lines. The playbook remains unnervingly familiar because it came from solving the same problems with different tools. Even the numbers tell a story with the rhythm of a drum. Uruk's white temple on a 13-meter platform. Ur's ziggurat at a base of 64 by 46 meters and a probable total height near 30. Mari's palace with 260 rooms across 2.5 hectares. Nineveh's walls around 12 kilometers with roughly 15 gates. Koldewey's reconstructed Ishtar Gate at 14 meters high, its ancient processional way, parading around 120 lions in luminous glaze. Etemenyanki's base around 91 by 91 meters, scraping a height that blew Greek minds, no matter which author they quoted. A Jewon aqueduct hundreds of meters long, carved from stone blocks, with inscriptions marching across them like structural tags. Numbers keep the marvels from drifting into myth and anchor the awe with something measurable. It helps to pause and admire the quiet, anonymous craft behind the royal names. Brickmakers knead clay with straw and stamp thousands of units a day in heat that would wilt modern interns. Carpenters coax straight beams out of crooked wood and then ferry them across a landscape with no cranes. Glaziers fire vast batches of bricks at consistent temperatures without modern thermometers, reading the color of flame and the smell of the kiln like a recipe passed down in a family that doesn't write measurements. Surveyors hold cords tight in the morning, cool to avoid heat stretch, and then count paces in long lines until the plan closes. The edge of the marvel is human labor, applied with precision across a whole city. The best debunk, finally, is that Mesopotamian architecture lives on only as a cautionary tale about mud and decay. The surviving objects argue louder. Walk the great ziggurat of Ur's staircase in the southern Iraqi sun, and the structure still throws a shadow with the weight of a thesis. Stand under a lamassu in a museum and realize the palace doorways framed people with those colossi for centuries. Glaze from Babylon still pops like a filter, turned to maximum saturation. Even the humble baked brick drain from Nippur says the quiet part out loud. Civilization depends on things that no tourist will photograph. The glory is a system working together. The story lands where it began, with a wonder and a gate. The allegedly hanging gardens read better as Assyrian Nineveh after the scholarship sift. But the idea animating them is absolutely Mesopotamian. Build terraces, beat gravity, bring water uphill. Stage a spectacle of green in a climate that tries to say no. The Ishtar Gate stands in Berlin, now rebuilt from thousands of ancient blue pieces and a steel frame, still calling minds to attention in a way modern advertisers would pay to bottle. The ziggurats stand as battered giants that keep phrases like sacred mountain in circulation. And the rest of the cities, the houses, drains, courtyards, walls, keep whispering the daily engineering that made the spectacular possible. Mesopotamia did not get fancy materials. It got big brains and a floodplain. Out of that came a civilization that treated architecture as law, theater, and survival strategy at the same time. The marvels are not parole from the practical. They are the practical, at a size that shocks. That is the trick. Stack enough good decisions, and a mud brick mountain turns into a skyline. Add glaze and processions, and a city becomes a story. Stamp bricks with names and dates, and posterity gets receipts. Then wait a few thousand years, brush the dust off, and the design still hit with the clarity of a new upload. The founding heroes in this saga are not mythical kings fighting monsters. They are surveyors setting lines, brickmakers stamping units, and architects using sun, wind, and water like instruments. Uruk's cone mosaics, Ur's ziggurat, Mari's palace, Nineveh's aqueduct, Babylon's blue gate, Dur-Shurukin's grid. Each one is an exclamation point. Together they form a paragraph that says, civilization, as seen in section and elevation, is a Mesopotamian invention with global consequences. That paragraph doesn't need a title. Carved in basalt, it has a voice, and it already filled a plain with towers. It still does. Next, let's turn our attention to the trade networks of ancient Arabia. Frankincense roots. A desert tree dripped its milky tears, and half the ancient world lost its mind. Emperors sent fleets. Priests burned fortunes. Caravans crossed 1,000 miles of emptiness for something that evaporated into scented smoke. Frankincense looked innocent in a basket, pale pebbles like sugared almonds. but it bankrolls one of the most audacious trade networks the ancient Near East ever ran. He gets the scene. It starts in the southeastern corner of Arabia, in a landscape that breaks the stereotype. The Dhofar coast of modern Oman goes green every summer under the Kharif monsoon. Limestone cliffs collect clouds like a sponge. Out of those rocky slopes, Boswellia sacra grips the stone with roots that refuse to quit. The locals call the resin laban because it oozes like milk when the bark is cut. Greek traders transliterate that to Libanos. Latin writers make it olibanum. The scent is clean and citrusy, with pine and spice, the kind that turns a temple into a sensory experience and a funeral into a luxury event. He lays down the process. No mystery, just precision. Harvesters score the bark with careful incisions. The first cut bleeds and crusts into brownish lumps. Those get scraped off and tossed. The second and third cuts yield brighter tears, translucent and pale. That's the money badge. Graders sort the resin by color and size. The whitest clumps from Dhofar and the Mara range carry the highest price. Somali frankincense, Boswellia freerana, gets love on the other side of the Gulf of Aden, but the most coveted Roman age grade often comes from the Omani and Yemeni cliffsides. Every tier carries chemistry. Essential oils like alpha-pinene and limonene for the aroma, boswellic acids that ancient healers insist calm inflammation, even if the actual pharmacology does not live up to influencer promises. 2,000 years earlier than anyone posts a wellness reel, priests, perfumers, and physicians build an economy around smoke that means something. He drops a timeline. Ancient Egyptians burn incense for the gods and for royal embalming. Queen Hatshepsut, around 1470 Bas, sends a famous expedition to Punt to fetch myrrh trees and exotic resins. That mission gets carved into stone at Deir al-Bahri like an ancient hype video. The incense craze builds toward the late Bronze and Iron Ages, but one invention changes the scale. The dromedary camel becomes a freight machine somewhere between 1200 and 1000 beach, fully deployed across Arabia by the 8th-7th centuries. Beasts, one hump, long legs, minimal water, and a taste for thorny shrubs. The desert suddenly looks like a highway system. He swings into the infrastructure. The South Arabian kingdoms rise on the back of this scented logistics. Sabah, Sheba around Marib, Kataban around Timnai, around Shabwa, Nayin in the Al-Jof, and later Esimia at Diafar. They are not caravans rolling aimlessly. They are irrigation engineers, toll collectors, and customs bead counters. The Great Dam of Marib, first built around the 8th-7th centuries by, and rebuilt at least twice, turns a dry valley into orchards and grain fields. Sabaean rulers, typals, carve inscriptions bragging about roadwork, wars, and the reliable flow of goods and taxes. The desert is not empty. It is paywalled. He changes camera angles and goes north, because the route does not end at the cliff where the resin bleeds. The Frankincense road pulls back across the empty quarter's edge, like a thread sewing the peninsula to the Mediterranean. Loads leave the Dhofar groves, cross into Mara and Ariamord, and funnel toward Shabwa, a city Strabo, writing around 20C, calls Sabota with 60 temples. Whether it is 60 temples or 60 towers depends on how a Greek ear heard a South Arabian boast. But archaeologists have dug the warehouses. Storage mattered. From Shabwa, the route shifts west to Timneh in Kataban, on toward Marib, then up through Najran along the western edge of the Rub al-Khali. North of Najran, caravans branch. One track runs toward Yathrib, later Medina. Another veers west through the Ephias. Others cut diagonally to the oasis chain that includes Kiryat al-Far. Yes, an actual desert city with painted walls, dining rooms, and a cemetery of stone-built tombs. Farther north lay Dedan and Hegra in the Ala Valley, later stuffed with Nabatean tomb facades. Then Petra. Then the ports of Gaza and the Levant. The whole run from Dhofar to Gaza clears 2,000 kilometers. A well-managed caravan could average 25-30 kilometers a day, which turns this into a months-long commitment, with intelligence in every hoofprint. He tosses in a reminder that not all roads run west. A Gulf route pulls Frankincense east to Jera on the Arabian side of the Persian Gulf, a city that Strabo reports with salt block houses and an obsession with trade profits. From Gera, the trail leads by sea and land to the Euphrates Deltascape and on to Babylon or Seleucia. Still other loads cross the short strait at Bab al-Mandeb, hit Adulis on the African shore, and run up into the kingdom that becomes Axum. The Frankincense network is not a single line through the desert. It is a braided river of routes, with toll booths on every bend. He sets the price mood with Roman drama, because Roman writers are very online about their incense habits. Pliny the Elder, Natural History Book 12, published in 77, rants about the drain of Roman coin to India, China, and Arabia, pegging it at about 100 million sesterces a year. That is around 25 million denarii, or roughly a million ori. With an aureus weighing about 7-8 grams, that is a number on the order of 8 metric tons of gold equivalent, disappearing from Italy annually in exchange for pepper, silk, and fragrant luxuries. Frankincense gets dragged into that scolding. Pliny describes the collection system in Aramort, down to the tax point, with priests keeping keys on the gates and royal revenues, lifted off every load. He names the stop-rate taxes and blames Roman vanity for paying them. The tone screams influencer, roast centuries before social media existed. He adds another Roman flex. Strabo says that under August, around the turn of the 1st century CE, roughly 120 ships a year sail from Egyptian Red Sea ports to India. Egyptian desert roads connect Berenike and Myos Hormuz to Coptus on the Nile, and from there everything rides the river to Alexandria. Roman merchants do not rely solely on overland Arab caravans. They set sail with the monsoon. The Periplus of the Erythraean Sea, a Greek mariner's guide written in the mid-1st century CE, breaks down the seaside of the incense business. It lists Moshka Limon, likely Khor Rori in Dhofar, and Kanas, modern Burj Ali on Yemen's coast, as the frankincense ports. It name-drops the Himyarite and Sabaean ruler Shari Baal, likely Karabil Watar Yohaneh, who sits at Wafar and controls the export permits. The Periplus comes off like a travel thread, except the comments cannot be turned off. It tells readers when to leave, where to exchange coin, which harbours are safe, and which officials need gifts. It does not do romance. It does schedules. He tracks the incense from cliff to ship, because the sea route flips the game. Monsoon science gets pinned to a Greek name, Hippolus, who supposedly figures out the direct open sea route in the late 1st century bus. The practical knowledge of monsoon winds did not begin with him. Indian and Arab sailors had used these winds long before a Greek writes them down. Still, when Roman traders realize they can leave in late June or July on the southwest monsoon, cross in roughly 40 to 50 days, and hit Muziris or Baragaza without hugging the coast, their profits go full send. On the return, they ride the northeast monsoon, late in the year back to the Red Sea. Frankincense gets loaded at Moshe or Qana, sometimes transshipped through Orcalis at Bab al-Mandeb, then hustled north to Berenica and out to the temples and perfume counters of the empire. Overland tolls still collect, but the monopoly of desert gatekeepers starts to crack. He rewinds to the pre-Seaborn golden age of the caravan, when the overland route out of South Arabia builds serious states. The Minayans, Majin, show up in inscriptions in the late first millennium Bas, with posts dotted along the oasis chain. Their presence is attested at Dedan in the Hejaz with Minian script graffiti and dedications which make sense, because the Minians specialize in long-distance trade. Qataban's capital at Timnai constructs the defensive wall, with a proud gate and scribbles tax ledgers in stone. Sabur builds the Awam temple. Maharam Bilqis, on the outskirts of Marib. In Avaramord, Shabwa's palace complex grows around fortified magazines. Roads run where the water runs, and every town that controls a cistern writes its name in stone, with the confidence that comes from being able to shut the door if a caravan gets uppity. He now walks into the showstopper of the north, Nabatea. This kingdom with a capital at Petra appears in Greek writing in 312 Bas, which is a very specific date, because that is when Antigonus I sends an army to catch them, and Diodorus Siculus writes the news. The Nabateans do not farm much at first. They sell logistics. They know where water hides under desert rock and where to cut a ladder into sandstone to pull a caravan up a cliff. In the 1st century Bas, under kings like Arataz, Iv-Naim, Bija-40 they turn the northern leg of the incense route into a monetized wonder. The road from Petra to Gaza gets studded with stations. Aboda, Avdot, Mamsis, Mamshit, Sabata, Shivta, Halusa. They farm wine in the Negev on runoff agriculture and export it back to the same Roman market, obsessed with incense. The desert starts looking like a spreadsheet, with water in the cell margins. He keeps the narrative's momentum with a Roman invasion gone wrong, because apparently someone always decides the best way to get a discount is to conquer the supplier. In 26 Bas, the prefect of Egypt, Aelius Gallus, launches a campaign toward the incense heartland. According to Strabo, 16422, he takes something like 10,000 troops, plus auxiliaries, and hires a Nabatean guide named Sileus, who leads them down a diet of bad advice and worse water sources. The army spends 6 months in the Arabian backcountry, reaches the vicinity of Marib exhausted, and turns around with dysentery as the only reliable output. The net result: no cheaper frankincense. The practical lesson is simple. Control of the route belongs to whoever understands the wells and the seasons. Rome can conquer cities. It cannot reprogram the peninsula's geography. He smooths into the economics with something tangible. A camel's load. A well-conditioned dromedary can carry 150 to 200 kilograms, but smart caravans keep the load lighter in summer heat and ration water by skill, not burner phone bravado. A caravan with 500 camels, which is not heroic by ancient standards, moves 75 to 100 metric tons of goods at a walking speed. The crates hold far more than frankincense. There is myrrh, more bitter and medicinal. There are aromatics like storax, cassia, and ladanum. There are pearls from Gulf fisheries. There are dyed textiles, worked silver, glassware on the northbound run, and wine, copper, and grain on the southbound return. He leans on Diodorus Siculus, Book 3, who calls Arabia Felix the Roman's name for the southern peninsula, rich in aromatics that grow nowhere else. Typical Greco-Roman exaggeration makes the region sound like a perpetual perfume commercial. The reality is grittier, high value, low-bulk commodities carried through hard terrain for profit by people who learned the map the slow way. He resets the perception of value with a Roman liturgical detail. Temples eat incense. Public sacrifices bring smoke. Household shrines need a pinch. Funerals go big because status never wastes a praise moment. Nero's over-the-top tendency becomes a meme because at Poppeia's funeral in 65 C reportedly burns spices from Arabia that exceed a year's supply. Tacitus mentions the extravagance. Pliny scolds in general. The linkage of cheap Roman moralizing and expensive fragrant smoke creates that distinctive aroma of hypocrisy that readers recognize across millennia. Regardless of who blames whom, the incense bill is very real. He layers in the politics south of the desert. The 1st century Bess and 1st century C, the rise of Inya. By around the 3rd century C, Emir absorbs Saba, Kataban, and Asaramort into a single state. Ruling from Ober, Safar in Greek, the year, Imyerid kings push the maritime option hard. Canaan grows as a deep anchorage, launching vessels up the Red Sea to Roman Egypt or across to India. South Arabian inscriptions and the Periplus speak to royal agents who set prices, issue licenses, and collect customs. Sharabal does not ring a bell in Latin class, but his power is clear. No export without the royal stamp. He drops anchor at Khor Rori because the archaeology writes the visuals for him. The ancient name is Sumhuram, founded in the late 1st century BC on a rocky peninsula that juts into a lagoon. The city's gatehouse funnels cargo into a narrow choke point. Storage rooms line the main street. Excavators recovered amphora stamps, South Arabian inscriptions, coins from far ports. The whole site fits the Periplus's Moshe Limon profile so perfectly it feels scripted. UNESCO calls it part of the land of Frankincense, a serial heritage listing that also includes Wadi Dorka's frankincense groves and the site of Shears. Marketed in the 1990s as Ubar, the Atlantis of the Sands, he does the myth-busting with a smile because the legend sells expeditions, but the evidence deserves airtime. The supposed lost city of Ubar headlined magazine covers in the early 1990s, with satellite imagery trails converging on a sinkhole site at Shiza. The hype promised a vanished city swallowed by the desert after an incense-fueled glory run. The archaeology delivered a small fort and a collapsed cast cavern, a practical outpost, not an Arabian Atlantis. The caution here lands with a friendly thud. The incense road built plenty of genuine cities. Shabwa, Timna, Marib, Petra, that leave massive stone receipts. The romance of a vanished metropolis is seductive. The reality is a network, not a single lost capital. He aims the camera at Palmyra, since the incense route has eastern branches that skip Gaza and head inland. Palmyra sits in the Syrian steppe and grows rich by becoming the customs office between Euphrates and Mediterranean. The Palmyrene tariff inscription of 137C lists duties on caravan goods with a level of bureaucratic detail that outlives empires. Spices and aromatics move through, with fees attached to each camel load. This is not free trade. This is regulated profit, inscribed in stone by people who understand exactly what a missed toll costs. He checks the coastal narrative on the Arabian side, because the Red Sea is not just a Roman lake. Adulis on the African shore turns into a warehouse for Aksum's ambitions. Soskiles, a petty king, named in the Periplus like he has a verified checkmark, operates at the entry of the 1st century. Aksum grows, mints coins in the 3rd century, and reaches across the water. In the early 6th century, Aksumite-backed rulers control Yemen. Abraha, an Aksumite general turned king, rules from Sana'a and builds monumental dams and churches between roughly 525 and 553, the Red Sea becomes a Christian South Arabian power space. Frankincense runs through it because Christianity, like earlier religions, loves liturgical smoke. Then the Sasanian Persians get involved around the 570s, as geopolitics does what geopolitics always does, which is change hands mid-transaction. He spirals back to the trees, because the economy starts in bark. The Boswellia sacra harvest cycles with the Kharif monsoon. The harvest happens in the dry season that follows. Skilled tappers move along cliffside routes and return to the same trees year after year. Overharvesting kills trees. Climate shifts unsettle groves. That means responsible management is not a modern invention. It is a survival strategy already embedded in ancient practice. Priestly oversight in the South Arabian system is not just a moral claim. It is a production manager's job description, dressed in sacred robes. He adds hard geography to the itinerary. In the old South Arabian texts, the word for frankincense appears as LBD or LBD, which is exactly where olivinum comes from. Caravan inscriptions along the Hijaz mark quarry sites, milestones, and altars. The route from Najran to Yathrib to Dedan runs past basalt plateaus and dry wadis. Cisterns cut into bedrock at desert towns like Hegra store rainwater behind locks and inscriptions. Nabatean engineers carve channels underfoot to trap flash floods. It looks like magic until a visitor notices the check dams in the gullies and the spoil piles around cistern mouths. Every trick has a footprint. He swings to the Levantine end because the finish line matters. Gaza booms in the Hellenistic and Roman periods as the point where incense meets Mediterranean shipping. Strabo mentions the city as a claws-out competitor in the trade. Customs houses line the quays. From Gaza, frankincense disperses across provincial markets. From Syrian baths to Egyptian temples to villas in Italy, the aroma of Arabia Felix survives every transfer. That is the point of aromatics. They travel well and declare their value instantly. He filters the script through a few lines of numbers to pin down price culture. Pliny rattles off approximate street prices for pepper and aromatics, with black pepper around 4 denarii per pound and long pepper around 15. He is less precise on frankincense, but his tone makes the pattern obvious. The harvesters receive a small slice. The middlemen and tax collectors take a bite at every gate, and the urban end user pays the markup with a shrug and a prayer. Not a single Roman Trimalchio cares what the profit margin is when the feasting room smells like sanctity and status. He faces down the most persistent image with a grin, the Queen of Sheba story. The biblical narrative in 1 Kings and 2 Chronicles mentions a queen bringing spices and gold to Solomon, which places resins in the headline of Iron Age diplomacy. The story is unprovable as literal cross-reference. The trade itself is not in doubt. South Arabia sends convoys up the peninsula during that era, and frankincense absolutely binds the interior kingdoms to Levantine consumption. The Sheba narrative folds a lot of commerce into one glittering visit, which is exactly how royal storytelling works. Temples receive the offerings. Caravans receive the contract renewals hidden in a legend. He tracks the turning point that rewires the network. Roman sea trade absolutely undercuts the monopoly of the interior route. By the 1st century CE, Petra's profits get squeezed. The empire annexes Nabatea in 106 under Trajan, renaming it the province of Arabia and building a paved road, the Via Nova Traiana, from Bostra in Syria to the Red Sea. That kind of asphalt-level control signals a pivot. Overland trade still runs, and desert towns do not vanish. But the fat margin moves to ports. Berenike, Myers Hormos, Arsinoe, and the South Arabian harbours at Karna and Karo Ruri. Customs posts follow the money, which is the most reliable law in antiquity. He cuts back to the eastern end of the map, because not all Mediterranean consumer culture leads to Rome. Parthian and later Sasanian empires in Iran consume incense in temples and households. The Gulf cities like Gera and later Hajar facilitate that eastern flow. Gera's location near modern Al-Hassa in Saudi Arabia positions it to siphon Arabian resins north to Mesopotamia. Strabo's salt block houses may be an exaggeration, but the city's reputation for wealth is not. The Gulf route remains an underappreciated leg of the incense machine, overshadowed by Roman obsession, but consistently profitable for anyone who can keep pirates and customs officers on the payroll. He shifts tone for a minute into logistics porn, because the desert taught supply chain management before MEBA programs even existed. Caravans need staging points every 2 to 3 days. That means wells, cisterns, and fodder for animals. Nabatean road stations in the Negev reveal built cisterns lined with plaster, channels that drive floodwater into storage basins, and guard posts that can see the horizon for miles. South Arabian highland roads have milestones and cleared routes across ridges. Timbrelled arches are not there. Check dams are. The practical is the sacred here. A working well in a wadi is a standing miracle. No wonder the inscriptions give thanks under a god's eye every time a caravan makes it through. He speaks plainly about security, since profit invites armed interest. Bedouin tribes tax the road through protection fees, which is not a crime when the contract is understood. Kingdoms turn those negotiated payments into posted tolls and written law. Caravan towns post watchmen. There are documented raids and recoveries. That is how the Aelius Gallus campaign ends up learning which side of a desert you can hold, which is not both. The caravan network's stability comes from relationships, not garrisons. That feature makes it resilient. It also limits any outsider's attempt to flip the system by force. He doubles back to a single grove, because the story gets lost without a rooted image. Wadi Dorka sits inland from Salalah in modern Oman. Scattered boswellia trees stand on gravel flats and gentle slopes. The bark has pale grey patches. The trunks twist in the wind. Each tree carries scars from decades of careful tapping. UNESCO lists the grove as heritage because the biology and the economy are inseparable. Ancient texts name the region. Modern chemistry breaks down the resin. The grove embodies the intersection of environment and empire-level desire. A small tree with a shallow root system pulls human beings into the same orbit from the Bronze Age to late antiquity. He folds in a quick debunk that matters to modern maps of memory. Pre-Islamic Mecca sits near the route that runs through the westerners Hijaz. Later texts speak of Quraysh caravans to Yemen and Syria, which places them within an established trade pattern by the 6th century CE. Archaeological visibility at Mecca is low for obvious reasons. Claims that it served as the central hub of the incense trade for 1,000 years overshoot the evidence. It likely participates in Western Hijaz caravan traffic in the centuries before Islam, but the overland incense monopoly earlier consolidates around Sabayan, Katabanite, Esarimite, Minian, and Nabatean nodes. Saying Mecca is on the network is fair. Saying it is the network's ancient capital rewrites geography to fit later fame. He zooms to Hegra, Madadan, Ali, because stone does not forget who paid for the good years. The Batian tomb facades there, carved in the 1st century, say, display inscriptions naming families, fines for tomb violation, and gods that protect property. The caravan link through Hegra to Petra is concrete enough to set in sand. Dedan beneath it bears older Leonite inscriptions from the 6th to 4th centuries Bath. Minian texts appear there too, Those stones are the comment section, arguing across generations about who ran which stretch of desert. Everyone leaves receipts. He takes the route across the Red Sea for a beat. Because Socotra is sitting out there looking like a fantasy island and waiting to be blamed for something it did not do. Greek sailors call it Dioscorida. It is famous for aloes and dragon's blood resin. It sits at the mouth of a maritime funnel and offers an anchorage to ships waiting on weather. Socotra's strangeness loaded sailors' stories with embellishments, but it is not the mother lode of frankincense. It is an outlet and a rest stop, and that role is not glamorous until the wind fails and an anchor holds. He dives into ritual usage because the demand side makes the whole system financially plausible. Egyptian temple rituals burn incense to purify, to feed the gods, to sanctify space. Greek and Roman practice uses incense liberally in sacrifices and at the imperial cult altars where civic loyalty and fragrance mix deliberately. Jewish rituals in the Second Temple include incense offerings with specific formulations guarded like intellectual property. Early Christian communities debate the ethics of incense because of associations with pagan sacrifice. Later Latin liturgy incorporates incense that becomes emblematic of worship. Even as Christianity grows, the demand never fully collapses. The form changes. The market adjusts. The road keeps whispering in smoke. He brings up climate and political entropy without turning it into a disaster movie. The Great Dam of Marib undergoes major repairs around the 5th century bus and again around the 1st century bus. Ancient texts and later Arabic traditions speak of a final collapse in the late 6th century, sometimes dated around 570. The story of the flood of Arimin becomes a marker for Yemeni migrations northward. How much of the frankincense trade depends on that dam is worth measured words. The agricultural foundation of Sabaean power is absolutely tied to water control. The incense trade piggybacks on that stability. When water management falters and long-distance sea trade keeps eating margin, inland kingdoms lose leverage. The decline reads as a long fade rather than a single cut. He grounds the numbers again with a simple comparison, which is how a viewer feels a trade balance beyond spreadsheets. A Roman soldier's annual pay in the 1st century CE sits in the zone of 900 sesterces for a legionary, before reforms, and higher later. Pliny's 100 million sesterces leaving the empire for luxuries and silk equals tens of thousands of legionaries' salaries in one flow. That drain is not bankrupting the empire, but it is heavy enough to make conservative writers clutch their laurel crowns. Every censer swing in a temple becomes a micro-argument about cultural decadence. Nothing is new under the sun, including fiscal scolding. He tags a fascinating side note that folds production and religion into one. Some ancient sources insist only levites or priests can tend incense in storage and distribution in certain temple contexts. In South Arabia, priestly control shows up in Pliny's description of the stockpile at Shabwa, guarded like a bank with fees enforced by sanctified muscle. That blend, sacred authority managing commercial logistics, feels exotic until someone remembers that medieval cathedrals ran wool markets and modern megachurches sell branded devotionals. Prophet loves a pulpit when markets attach meaning to merchandise. He tightens the camera on a single node, Karna, on Yemen's southern coast. Archaeology at Bir Ali reveals quay walls and warehouse foundations, shards of imported amphorae and South Arabian inscriptions naming officials. The harbour sits behind a coral reef-protected lagoon. Ships with square sails and stern rudders ride the monsoon in and out. The periplus positions Karna as the wintering point where cargo waits for the right wind. Frankincense moves from the inland tracks at Shabwa to Kanani by camel in a week or two, depending on the season, then loads into hulls bound for Egyptian or Indian markets. The system uses time like a tool. Miss the wind, and profits rot in bags. He zips up the coast to Aden. Eudaemon Arabia in the Greek sources. People hear Eudaemon and think happy. The name probably comes from the prosperity that flies out of that harbour when winds favour it. The Periplus paints Aden as it has been under Roman rule, with direct routes bypassing it, but the harbour itself booms again and again in later centuries. If a market can hold a shelter and a warehouse where the monsoon turns, it will not stay quiet for long. He leans into sensory detail because the trade is otherwise just ledger math. The resin tears go into leather bags. The smell is sharp, piney, with lemon and pepper notes. In a closed storeroom, it walks into the nose, even from sealed sacks. Mixed with myrrh, the scent turns more medicinal and darker. Burned on charcoal, in a bronze steamy Ethereum, the cloud rises blue-white and clings to stone. That smell is a printer ink of memory. It stamps homes, sanctuaries, baths, ships' holds, and graves with a signature that ignores cultural boundaries. He breaks hard at the best kind of late antique twist, new power's old roots. In the 3rd century C, the Roman economy wobbles, the frontiers flex, and yet the Berenike papyri continue to show customs tallies of aromatics, textiles, and glass passing through the Red Sea ports. Aksum grows stronger. Insomnia thrives on a South Arabian unification. Persian interests grow in the Gulf. Jewish and Christian communities in Yemen anchor networks with personal and ritual ties to incense. Then the 6th century gets complicated. Dunuas, a Himyarite king, persecutes Christians at Nadran around 523 C. Aksum invades with Byzantine encouragement. Abraha rules Yemen as an Aksumite vassal. Byzantine and Persian empires fight one another or flirt with alliances. The Persian Sasanians take Yemen around 570. The same year shows up in South Arabian law as the Year of the Elephant, when Abraha fails on a march toward Mecca. Frankincense still burns in churches. The caravan road remains passable. The network's profit margin is slimmer, but the habit lives. He threads in a modern contrast because some myths deserve a gentle nudge back into context. Essential oils rise in 21st century wellness culture, like they discovered a lost science. Ancient texts already had the recipes and most of the same claims. From anti-inflammatory properties to mood-stabilizing fumes, boswellic acids do show pharmacological activity. Their bioavailability through burning is a separate matter. Ancient practitioners did not read peer-reviewed journals. They read rooms filled with people who believed smoke carried prayers. The incense root sells meaning as much as it sells aroma. That is why it outlived kingdoms. He circles to a final stretch of road, this time from Petra to Gaza, because the visuals in that corridor let the story tie off its loose threads. Petra's Seek is a narrow chasm that funnels people wrongly into thinking the city hides from the world. It does not hide. It advertises. The treasury facade is a billboard telling every caravan that the toll revenue funds architecture that can talk to gods. West of Petra, the road crosses the Araba toward Isla, Roman Aqaba, and up through the Negev towns that archaeologists have mapped in detail. Cisterns, guard posts, wine presses with settling vats, flour mills, stables. The incense runs with the wine carts, because shipping out is easier when there is always something on the return leg. The Roman bureaucracy sets custom rates, clamps down on evasion, and counts amphorae like accountants with spears. He rolls back a century and adds Palmyra again, because a small inscription can crown a big story. In 137 Su, the Palmyrene tariff imposes a duty per camel load of aromatics with a sliding rate based on quality. The wording lists categories: the fine stuff from the south, the coarser resin, the mixes. This is not hand-waving. This is an index. The network internalizes quality control, the way any product category matures. Ivory and spices get similar treatment. Frankincense never stands alone. It stands in a chorus line of goods that teach consumers to demand grades and pay accordingly. He gives one last set of characters, this time real and carved in stone, to show the human fingerprints. Karabil Watar in Saba, whose 7th century beast inscriptions at the Awam temple boast of victories and building canals. Yedai idea, Bayan of Haramot, who turns Shabwa into a capital with a sense of destiny. Kings of Kataban who leave inscriptions on bronze plaques saying who paid for a gate and which god got the credit. Aratus Ivan Petra, whose coins carry his portrait, and a script that mingles Aramaic letters with the king's practical ambition. These are not imaginary figures, invented to make a caravan plausible. They are as real as the scars on the frankincense trees. He threads the epilogue into the early 7th century, when Islam arises in Western Arabia, and the peninsula's trade routes rewire around new centers and new legal frameworks. The Quran references the people of the grove and the flood at Marib. The incense route morphs as the caliphate's networks prioritize grain, coin, and internal political flows. Frankincense does not vanish, it adapts. Coptic churches in Egypt, Syriac liturgies in Mesopotamia, Byzantine rites in the Mediterranean continue to burn it. Medieval merchants continue to source it off Arabia and the Horn of Africa. The ancient system's memory persists in place names and in storerooms with a lingering scent that refuses to retire. He leaves the viewer with one last tactile reality. Frankincense smells like ritual and wealth, but it tastes like dust in a caravan guard's mouth after a day across basalt crusts. It looks like white pebbles that collect sweat and sand in a leather bag. It feels like sticky sap on a knife blade. The road that carries it feels like granite under a camel's hoof and the soft crunch of a gravel wadi under sandal leather. The data points come with numbers. 1 century fleets of 120 ships, a Roman outflow of 100 million sesterces, hundreds of kilometers between cisterns. Trees yielding resin multiple times a season. But the math hangs on a human habit. People like to burn meaning into the air and watch it rise. Ancient Arabia sold that habit and made the desert into a ledger of temples, tolls, and cliffs that bleed milk. He adds the last to debunk gently, because appealing myths deserve a graceful exit. The incense route did not run on one secret city, one queen, or one heroic navigator. It ran on thousands of choices, some carved in stone and some cut into bark. Strabo's cheerfully biased geography, Pliny's anxious consumer commentary, the Periplus's practical sailing tips, and Subarbian inscriptions that read like annual reports all agree on the essentials. Frankincense is extracted from specific zones: Darfur, Maha, the eastern Yemeni highlands, and across the water in the Horn of Africa. It moves on planned roads and seasonal winds. Middlemen monetize it with tolls and honors. Consumers light it in rites that bind communities and justify the expense. Empires bend to fit around those facts, rather than bending the facts to fit their ambitions. He closes with a visual that sticks. Somewhere on the Dhofar escarpment in the 1st century, Sir, a worker in a linen wrap wipes resin from a blade and drops translucent tears into a bag stamped with an owner's mark. That bag will rattle on a camel past Shabwa's gatekeepers, sit under a warehouse roof at Karna, cross the Red Sea in a hole that smells of pitch and salt, ride up the Nile to Alexandria, and land eventually in a bronze burner in Rome, Antioch, Jerusalem, or Memphis. The smoke that rises pays the priest, the porter, the king, the sailor, the camel owner, and the taxman. The scent turns into memory. The route turns into world history, and the desert, which outsiders keep calling empty, turns out to be a marketplace with the best product pitch ever written. It disappears into the air and still manages to linger. Let's dive into our next piece. Why it sucked to be a medieval gravedigger. The bell starts before the sun does, and you move before your spine decides it disagrees. You belong to a world where death has a schedule, and you keep it. The parish keeps a spade for you in a corner of the porch, the iron bright where it has been sharpened against stone. The wood smells like damp oak and old sweat. It is not a grand tool. It is the thing that makes the ground open. You live inside the sounds of a medieval town. Hens, hoofbeats, the scrape of cartwheels, and that bell. The passing bell calls you because someone has stopped breathing. The knell will follow to tell the neighborhood how many years that soul survived. 1 stroke for each decade in some places. 4 strokes and a pause. And 4 more tells everyone that a little child is gone. You do not write obituaries. You open the earth. The body arrives rolled in linen. Nearly everyone goes into the ground wrapped, not boxed. Coffins are for moneyed families and special occasions, sometimes used to carry to the church and then retrieved for the next funeral like a reusable grocery tote. A bier is more common. Boards in a frame, splinters catching at shroud cloth. The parish priest or vicar chants the words off the psalm rite if you are in England, or one of its cousins if you are in France or Italy. You hear the same phrases every day. Libera me, Domini, in paradisum deducent, tangeli. The Latin slides over you like a habit. The Office of the Dead makes a soundtrack that never stops. People later call it a dirge because of the opening word. Dirge. That is your radio station. You know directions the way sailors know. Stars. The head goes to the west, feet to the east, so that a Christian body can rise, facing the dawn on Judgment Day. The grave usually runs about waist deep in your world, often 3 or 4 feet, sometimes deeper in dry soil, often much shallower. In churchyards, stuffed to bursting. That famous 6 feet under lime is a 17th century London public health order from 1665. Not your era. The mayor told plague burials to go 6 feet deep during the Great Plague. Long after your bones will already be part of somebody else's problem. Medieval churchyards are quilts of bones in layers, not neat plots like modern suburbia. Your work is a job with a job title. In a lot of parishes you carry the keys as sexton, or you work under the sexton, a church officer with a set of tasks that reads like a medieval multi-tool. Sweep, ring bells, dig graves, mend fences, fetch water, light candles, keep out pigs. Parish clerks in London get formal recognition by the mid-1400s as the Company of Parish Clerks, but your job existed far earlier, written into accounts as payments for spade work and fees for bell ringing. During ordinary years, you keep your hands busy with 1 or 2 burials a week in a small place, more in a city. During bad years, you stop counting. Bad years come often enough to be named. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1317 shaves flesh off the world, and takes people who never thought they would die in a field ditch. And you work like a beast then. But the thing that lights your job on fire arrives in 1347 at Messina in Sicily, and within a year it is in England and France and everywhere on the trade map. Everyone will call it the Black Death. Later, your contemporaries just call it the pestilence. Men like Henry Knighton at Leicester and the monks at St. Albans write the same thing with different handwriting. Bodies are everywhere. Mortalities reach eye-watering levels, 30 to 50% across regions, higher in dense cities, lower in isolated hamlets. In England, the typical estimate settles near 40 to 50%. That is not a rumour. That is you digging trenches in October 1348 and still digging in May 1349. With the same numbed hands. Plague makes you an emergency worker with a shovel. In places like Florence, the municipal records and later accounts mention Bikini, the gravediggers, ferrying corpses out of shattered houses. Giovanni Boccaccio, in 1353, describes pits and carts and linen bundles. In Siena, Agnolo di Tura writes that he buried his children with his own hands, and you feel sick even hearing about it. In London, archaeologists from the Museum of London Archaeology uncovered a dedicated plague cemetery at East Smithfield, used between 1348 and 1350. They find hundreds of bodies, laid in ordered layers in long trenches, often with care, sometimes with rosary beads, always fast, because your shovel is moving faster than grief can. DNA work published in the 2010 S confirms Yersinia pestis in the teeth, the bacterium itself standing up across centuries and saying that yes, this is what did it. You become part of a machine you would never design, if anyone asked your opinion. Bells are limited by local decrees like the 1348 ordinances of Pistoia in Tuscany, which clamp down on funeral processions, limit numbers of mourners, and push burials outside the city centre. The logic is to avoid crowding and stop the air from being loaded with grief and candles and possibly bad vapours. Miasma theory rules the day. The air itself looks guilty. The smell seems like evidence. People hold pomanders, little balls filled with herbs, and soak cloth with vinegar to press at their nostrils. Beak masks with glass eyes do not belong to your century. That image belongs to later plague scares. Your protective equipment looks like the largest handful of time your yard can spare, and a hood pulled tight. You learn anatomy in the wrong way. The ground in churchyards is lumpy with accumulated history. Graves are not solitary. They are strata. You open a new pit and immediately meet someone older than your grandfather. Bones are disarticulated, cleaned by time, and settled into corners. Charnel houses exist for that reason. When you find older bones, you lift them and carry them with respect to the charnel, which is a kind of bone library. Two of the best preserved in England sit at Rothwell in Northamptonshire and at Hythe in Kent. Rothwell's Charles Chapel, built in the 13th century, houses thousands upon thousands of bones, stacked by type in careful geometry. Skulls and femurs and tibias, arranged like a memento mori calendar. Hythe's ossuary includes around 1,000 skulls and far more bones. The idea is blunt and sacred at once. All of us end here, and you make room the practical way. You know what excommunication means when you are carrying a body at night under your cloak because the family begged you to dig at the very edge of consecrated ground. Canon law in the medieval church ordinarily denies church burial to excommunicates, suicides, and some criminals. Executed bodies often go into the ground near gallows, away from parish yards. You do not write the rules. You enforce them with a spade. The line between consecrated and not consecrated ground runs like a fence in your head, and you hold that line even when people press coins into your palm and ask for a look the other way. Burial is not only a final kindness, it is a spiritual necessity in a world ordered around purgatory and prayers for the dead. Testaments leave money for candles, for bells, for masses. One for today, one for tomorrow, 100 on the anniversary if the estate is large. The dead owe their best beast as a mortuary fee in some parts of England, a custom with deep roots. The parish, in turn, owes a decent burial. You become the one who keeps the pact. That is why your job carries a sliver of dignity, even when your hands are cracked and your clothes smell like wet soil and candle wax. When the pestilence runs, your workload needs a ledger and a mercy. London's East Smithfield trenches show stacked layers, bodies placed head to toe, sometimes separated by a thin layer of soil, sprinkled like a rushed benediction. In the Charterhouse Square site found in 2013 during Crossrail works, at least dozens of plague victims were uncovered with signs of organized burial. This is not chaos. This is speed with care. You and the other diggers work in teams. One breaking the clay, one shoveling out, one hauling, one placing. It is improvisation in the shape of a trench. You live through wage chaos, because everyone does. Labourers across Europe charge more after 1349, because everyone who can work has leverage when half their neighbours are dead. The English government answers with the Ordinance of Labourers in 1349 and the Statute of Labourers in 1351, trying to cap wages at pre-plague levels. It lists rates for harvesters and masons and others. Gravediggers skate under the radar as parish hired hands, but you feel the pressure. In some places your fee per grave goes up in practice despite the law. Parish accounts from plague years show spikes in payments for digging, for carrying, for ale given to workers during burial rushes. Money buys speed. Ale keeps you on your feet. You accept both and still go home empty of food some nights, because the markets are wild and the fields are short of hands. You handle bodies quickly and with particular moves, learned by doing. Shroud cloth binds at hands and feet to keep limbs from slipping out, and you lift using the slack. If the corpse has been dead long enough, the smell announces itself before the bier reaches the church gate. Lime appears sometimes, but not the way a dozen movies insist. Quicklime does not magically eat a body in hours. It can even preserve by drying depending on conditions. Archaeologists at plague sites in London do not find universal layers of lime. In some places, yes. In many places, no. Lime is a management tool for smell and fluids, not a medieval incinerator. You exist in a Europe that believes in revenants with enough stubbornness that bones sometimes tell the story, centuries later. In eastern England, at Warren Percy, a deserted medieval village, researchers published evidence in 2017 of bodies showing post-mortem dismemberment and burning from the 10th to 14th centuries, likely related to practices meant to keep the dead from walking. Elsewhere in Europe, graves with stones in mouths or stakes through torsos appear in that long twilight between superstition and ritual. As the man with the spade, you are sometimes the one expected to pin down fear, literally. You do not argue theology when someone puts a heavy rock over a ribcage. You set the stone where they want it and tamped the soil hard and move on to the next. Normal weeks return occasionally, like a truce. You handle the funeral kit, the pall that drapes the bier, the cross, the torches. The parish holds them in a locked chest, and you carry them out for use, in and out like a portable theatre. The service is short if the day is cold, and the grave is ready longer if the family paid for extra bells and masses. You hear the office of the dead again, libera me, again. You talk to nobody about it, and you talk to everyone after hours, with ale, without dramatics, without invocations. The daily routine fits like a glove you cannot take off. The soil changes with seasons, the way faces do. In winter, the top layer freezes, stone hard in the morning and slick by noon. In spring, you dig in a slurry. Churchyards sit in low places, and water seeks you with the patience of a saint. You haul buckets up because a hole becomes a well, if you stand there long enough. Sand collapses, clay resists, chalk scrapes, peat eats your boots. Your shoulders remember, every soil type long after your head forgets. The spade is an extension of your arm, in the way a sword is an extension of somebody else's. People think your job is just holes, but the inside work is worse on the back. Burials under the church floor bring money to the parish and bragging rights to families. Interior burials become fashionable and aromatic. The underfloor fills with bodies faster than anyone plans. You lift paving stones, dig in tight spaces, slide a body into a slot beside a pillar, and breathe through cloth, because air within the church can grow heavy. Attempts to regulate indoor burials arrive across centuries because people finally complain about the smell of salvation becoming too literal. Before rules tighten in later centuries, the 1300s and 1400s see plenty of indoor burials, and you learn to lever flagstones without cracking them. Stone cutting pays better, but you have your niche. Your neighborhood holds a quiet knowledge about disease that medical theory does not. People stop visiting houses where someone coughs blood because they know who dies faster. Bubonic plague, with its swollen buboes, probably spares more of your co-workers handling shrouds outdoors than the nightmare version. Pneumonic plague, which spreads by breath, kills households within days, and scares even the priest into muffled prayers from a distance. You become a flea's landlord whether you know it or not, handling clothing and bedding that can carry the vector. Nobody uses the word vector around you. Your skin does not care about vocabulary. It cares about itching. The social hierarchy treats you like a broom that speaks. You are essential and not celebrated. An elite burial gets carved stone and painted images and epitaphs with a family's French or Latin content. Your corner of the ledger lists expenses. 3 pence for digging, 1 penny for bell ringing, candles, 5 gallons of ale for the men. Parish accounts in the later 14th century mention payments for spade work, not because anyone tries to flatter you, but because the warden must balance the book. You are a line item with blisters. You are also, awkwardly, a person. You carry small coins home and find a way to feed a family. Statutes that cap. Wages do not cap hunger. Not every medieval place pays the same. In a bustling city, you might earn day wages closer to skilled labor in plague years, because nobody can find enough hands. Then watch rates collapse back toward pre-plague levels after 1351, as authorities push down. Across the North Sea, German cities develop their own burial systems, sometimes with municipal supervision and fees. Italian cities like Florence and Venice move fast to regulate, to isolate hospitals for the sick, to hire teams for carrying the dead. You watch your role slide between parish tradition and city bureaucracy depending on where you stand. The tools betray time. Iron is expensive and heavy. A spade is sharpened often to cut roots. A mattock breaks soil where the spade will not. A barrow takes the soil to a spoil heap that seems to grow like a hill on the edge of the yard. You wear through shoes within months, if you can afford shoes. In warm seasons, you step on the spade barefoot, the way labourers do everywhere, because you need the feel and the leverage. Your feet build calluses like armour. Your knees talk to you at night, and not in a friendly tone. Your memory becomes the cemetery's unofficial map. Wooden markers rot quickly. Stone markers exist mainly for the wealthy. Most graves carry only a general sense of place and the recollection of relatives. You keep a mental geography of who lies where to avoid cutting through someone recently buried. Reuse is a feature, not a bug. After years, and not always many, bones lift and reroute to the charnel. The ground rises as if the earth itself puffs up with lives. A churchyard 2 centuries old often sits higher than the surrounding street. A tabletop made of settled burials and thrown soil. Clothes tell stories too. People are buried primarily in shrouds in your time, not because cloth is cheap, but because it is pious and simple. Sumptuary laws and sermons discourage burying riches with the dead. One's treasure belongs to family, to church, to alms for the poor, not to the grave. That makes for less temptation for the living. A ring or a belt might stay with someone occasionally, and you hear gossip about stolen grave goods in manorial court rolls and city records. It happens. It offends. It is also rarer than some future storytellers pretend. Your main theft is time, and fate steals it from you daily. Not all bodies are equal. The suspicion around those who die by their own hand, the shame assigned to executed criminals, the edge-of-yard burials for people without proper reconciliation, all of that falls into your wheelbarrow. You do not announce it on the street. You know which graves draw nightly candles and which do not. You feel the social hierarchy in the number of mourners and the weight of the pall. You do an even job in the earth, because the job in earth is simple math. Width, depth, tamp. Your environment, especially in big cities, casseroles death into art to tell a moral. Paris paints the Danse Macabre on charnel house walls in the early 1400s, a mural of death, leading popes and peasants in the same line. Les Innocents, the city's largest cemetery, becomes famous for walls lined with bones. That site continues into the early modern period, and later, when removal of remains in the 1780s sends them to the catacombs. But your century starts the theme. Bones as teaching tool. Skulls as public lecture. You do not need the fresco to know the lesson. You sleep beside it. The plague accelerates everything, including the reputation that gravediggers become paradoxically wealthy. Some florins move quickly in Italian cities for those who will handle the dead when nobody else will. The trade-off is brutal. Mortality among clergy during the Black Death runs high. Some dioceses report losing nearly half the men in orders. If the men who bless the graves die at that rate, the man who digs sits right in the blast radius. You work outside, which helps. You handle the dead, which does not. The ledger line that shows a bump in payment buys you better bread for as long as you can eat it. When cities run out of room, they improvise. In London, East Smithfield is created specifically for plague burials. In Italian cities, new ground is consecrated outside the walls. In Germany, cemeteries push outward. The shift does not mean abandonments of tradition. Orientation remains east-west. Shrouds remain shrouds. Prayers follow shape. The emergency is scale, not rituals. You live through volume. The moment the worst passes, the living rebuild the idea of normal with a speed that suggests amnesia is a survival skill. Weddings return. Market days vibrate. You go back to a rhythm of 1 or 2 burials a week in many towns. Rumor shrinks to normal size. You do routine maintenance on the fence. You fix a hole where a pig pushed through to investigate. It becomes a story that you tell with a laugh later. A pig learns nothing from a charnel house. Pigs are consistent. People pretend to be. Myths stick because they fit the mood. Lime as instant dissolver, not accurate. 6 feet is medieval standard depth. Not true. Beak-masked plague doctors roaming every village in the 1300s. Anachronistic. The reality is less cinematic and more repetitive. Shovels, bells, linen, prayers. Yet the weirdness still shows up in details you cannot sanitize. Some communities put a stone in a corpse mouth to stop imagined vampirism. Some people want stakes through torsos. In a corner of eastern England, bones tell of burning after death to break a fear. Archaeologists and historians publish this in the 21st century so the past can say, with data, that it was stranger than your tidy textbook once allowed. You collect a running list of injury types the job gifts you for free. Your back turns to oak. Your fingers split in winter. You develop something between a cough and a creed because the damp air of a church sinks into your lungs. A mishandled barrow tips and unloads half a ton of wet soil onto your feet. A grave wall collapses and introduces you to panic in a hole. A tomb slab inside the church decided it preferred landing on flesh before stone. You carry scars like proof of membership. Financially, you live where medieval economics likes to pin people. Enough to get by, not enough to stop. Parish accounts sometimes show payments in kind. Grain, ale, a cloak. Money is not the only currency. A cask of ale appears impressively, often in the records, because beer is safety when the water is not to be trusted. The taste of sour ale after a long burial feels like a friend who understands you better than your family does. The headache later feels like divine judgment. You know the scent of incense from a mile away. Frankincense and myrrh mix with tallow and beeswax from the candles, and sweat from the living, and a deeper scent beneath. People talk bravely about the stench of sin. You have a more practical vocabulary, louder in your nose and shorter in your patience. You develop tricks. Sniff cloth, chew mint leaves, hold breath. Not every trick works. Death refuses to be tricked into smelling like cinnamon. In some regions, municipal authorities eventually create orders about grave depth and spacing. Those rules appear more often in the early modern period, but seeds are planted in your time. The ordinances of Pistoia specify rapid burial and restrictions on wakes. Venice later restricts burial inside churches for hygiene. Paris regulates cemeteries as the less innocence problem becomes politically pungent. Your century's main policy is not yet scientific, but it is observational. People notice when the yard swells and the neighborhood mold problem gets theological. You cut through misconceptions about work and devotion with your own body. Burying the dead is framed as a corporal work of mercy in the Christian catalogue of good deeds. The idea echoes from monastic texts to homilies to ordinary speech. The work is pious, the pay is necessary. The discomfort is guaranteed. You perform a service that the culture treats as holy and looks at sideways. The contradiction feels raw and permanent. Bone and soil teach you that individuality collapses in a charnel house and then reappears in pockets. Skulls are skulls until someone turns one, and you see a healed injury that looks like a map. A broken femur that mended makes you think of months in bed and somebody who fed that person. Teeth with grooves tell you someone chewed thread. As a habit, maybe a seamstress. You carry bones that once carried people, and you do not narrate it aloud, because nobody asks what you saw in the charnel. They ask if the grave will be ready by matins. It will be ready. A funeral in bright weather feels almost like theatre. The choir sings, sometimes with better pitch than you expect. Children watch with round eyes. Adults watch behind faces made to be polite. Their own private math running in the background. What those masses cost. Whether the plot sits near the yew tree. Whether the neighbours will comment. You tamp the grave flat after the final prayers. Rake the mound smooth and lay down a wooden marker, or a stone if one exists yet. You retired your belt. You stand, and your knees send a telegram to your skull. You ignore that telegram. There is a small industry around death that you see from the backstage. Candle makers get orders. Linen sellers get orders. The man who carves letters into stone gets orders if the family is wealthy. Priests and friars get stipends for prayers. Trentals of 30 masses, anniversaries, birthdays of saints. Monastic houses thrive on endowments for chantries. Little chapels funded to remember a specific person forever. Forever proves to be shorter than donors imagine when chantries are swept away during later reforms. But your era treats them as long-term investments. When you dig near a chantry chapel, you think every shovelful sounds richer. Some dead carry politics into the ground. Local magnates go under alabaster effigies that force you to keep your spade respectful and a foot away. Because those tombs are expensive and fragile. Burials in friary churches spike because people love the idea that Dominican or Franciscan prayers will anchor their souls. Later reformers will accuse friars of turning death into a money-making machine. You watch funerals and know that death is also a job creator for carpenters, cloth merchants, and bell ringers. Your piece of that economic web is heavy and muddy. Your craft includes crisis logistics. During plague peaks, carts move bodies because there are too many to carry. Towns issue orders. Bury quickly. Avoid wakes with elaborate feasting. Limit the number of attendants. Close city gates against strangers. Checkpoints appear. The logic is obvious. Your shovel is the final checkpoint. The aftershocks last for decades. With a smaller population, wages for laborers stay higher for a while. Food prices wobble. Land changes hands. A generation grows up who never met some of their grandparents. Guilds recruit new men. Fields sit fallow. In England, lords complain incessantly about labour shortages. The government complains in legal language about service and custom. You keep digging for families who survived and rebuilt. Routine funerals return. The plague does not go away. It returns in waves in 1361 and later. You learn the rhythm of peace and spike like a sea that never quits. The sound that marks the job sticks in your head. Bells always, big and small, hand and tower. The Sanctus bell rings, the sacristan's keys jingle, and your own modest bell for the beer dings in a cut-glass tone. When the wind is right, the entire town becomes a choir and a warning. You synchronize your days by those vibrations. You become the metronome of mortality. The job eats clothing. Work tunics shred at knees. Hoods fray. An extra cloak appears as pay in kind. In a winter, when coin is tight, your hands tell you that wool weighs as much as stone when soaked through. Leather stiffens and cracks after a freeze. You hang garments by a smoky fire, and they take weeks to forget the scent of the dead. You learn to live with it. Visitors from far centuries later will tell you a version of your life that fits their entertainment needs. They will imagine you as a skull-juggling jester or a ghoul in a ditch. The truth is more middle of the road, and therefore more brutal. You are a working person in a system with too many dead and not enough ground. You try very hard not to get sick. You develop expert knowledge nobody asked for. Where the water table sits in a wet spring, how to angle a grave to avoid a root that will twist a coffin lid or a shroud, how to lift a beer without throwing out your back, how to place a final handful of soil so it lands quietly. You learn to love benches because sitting matters. Church porches have stone benches because medieval churches are community centres as much as places of worship. You sit there in the afternoon, boots caked, and listen to a priest talk about the corruptible part of man descending to the dust, and feel that this is a fine philosophical point, delivered far from the mud. You nod politely. You also note the next task. Replace a latch on the yard gate so cows stay out. Theology waits. Cattle do not. Change crawls through your world, disguised as repetition. The Sarum rite remains in use in England until the mid-1500s. Charnel houses acquire bone murals. Parish clerks in London get their formal charter in 1442. Those markers would look to a time traveller like separate entries in a timeline. To you, they fall into a routine. Dig, ring, carry, tamp, repair, count, sleep, repeat. You see enough to develop a harsh mercy towards superstitions. People bring charms and recite protective prayers. They put broom branches at doors to keep out sickness. They whisper about strangers, poisoning wells during plague years. That last rumor ignites violence. Jewish communities suffer massacres in 1348 and 1349, accused of crimes the disease has already committed. You notice what fear does to neighbors who previously traded bread and iron and friendly insults. You want fewer rumors. Your job guarantees that rumor has steady fuel. There are days the whole refuses you. The ground collapses in on itself. Your anger spikes. You speak to the earth like it is a stubborn animal that can be shamed into cooperation. You are not persuasive. You rebuild the wall and prop it with boards. You learn a builder's trick. You finish the grave just as the funeral procession rounds the corner, and you have just enough time to brush mud off your knees and try for dignity. The dignity lasts 3 minutes. The spade calls again. The people who come through your hands carry an entire catalogue of causes, feathers and falls, childbirth, the bleeds on and on. One man who fell from a roof and wore that story on his skull. One woman who lived through 3 famines and 2 plagues and finally died of old age. If any phrase deserves that courtesy title in a century like yours. Your bones will go into the same ground later, and someone like you will dig up your femur in 50 years and move it to the charnel. That is the closest thing to immortality that you believe in by the end. A historian flips through a parchment and finds you by accident in a ledger. Paid 2 days for digging a grave, 1 day for ringing, ale supplied. The ink is neat. The scribe writes your name when he knows it, and calls you the digger when he does not. You are evidence of systems that function and systems that fail. You are the human factor in a series of rules. Plague years rip the rhythm into shreds. In some places, corpses go from home to cemetery without mass because there are not enough living priests. Orders from bishops excuse normal rites for emergency speed. People make the sign of the cross over their own children in the street. You shovel like a madman. You go home and shut your eyes and hear the bell still. You learn to sleep through it because exhaustion overpowers custom. Evidence for what you do is not only in words. Bone pits talk. The East Smithfield skeletons did not show signs of chaotic dumping. Bodies are placed on their backs, arms at sides or crossed, sometimes with incidental items like a coin that fell from a pocket or a belt buckle left, because cutting it would have cost precious seconds. An entire layer might contain dozens, arranged like an organized dormitory. That's your logistics on display. Efficiency disguised as compassion, or compassion disguised as efficiency. The two kiss often in your line of work. At the edges of the map, beyond the cities, small parishes have less drama and more continuity. People you bury are people you have seen every market day for 20 years. You remember them buying onions and laughing. You bury them near their parents. You tamp the soil and pat it in a gesture that is more for you than for theology. You see that grief as common choreography, whether for a peasant with cracked hands or a merchant with rings like tiny suns. You erase footprints around fresh grave so that stray dogs do not investigate. Because dogs in towns run as packs, you build a temporary fence. You chase boys out of the yard when they turn it into a shortcut, not because of solemnity, but because one day they will fall into an open hole and you will have to dig them out and explain yourself to 30 angry relatives. You learn prevention as self-defense. Inside the parish structure, your job sits low on the ladder of clerical and lay offices, but it connects to everything. People call you to beat the bounds of the parish because you know where boundaries lie. You carry the processional cross on rogation days. You pay attention in church courts because sometimes people argue about burial rites and fees, and you testify that you dug where you were told. You learn how to speak politely to two men with opposing opinions and walk away on friendly terms with both. That survival skill beats any spade in your kit. Disasters make lists that outlive memory. A winter that freezes graves and forces indoor burials until the thaw. A local battle that ends with a pile of bodies dumped into a trench outside town. Because even if chivalry decorates the story later with trumpets, a field littered with corpses gets handled by you and men like you. Bodies of soldiers arrive with different problems. Armor to remove, missing heads, or wounds that drip onto your boots. The church hesitates over consecration. The earth does not. You do that work quietly while the chroniclers write about banners. Food tastes better on days with fewer burials. Cheese has a sharper edge. Bread has a better smell. Wine slides easier. You notice this and grin without telling anyone because it feels like casual sacrilege. You are not irreverent. You are seasoned. You whisper prayers anyway. When you go down into a grave to check footing, earth moves. Earth does not care. You try to care enough for both of you. Centuries later, people will argue online about whether medieval cemeteries were hygienic and whether society had anything resembling public health. You answer from experience through artifacts. Ordinances like those in Pistoia in 1348 show a city trying to regulate funerals to slow contagion. Venice will later isolate lazarettos on islands. Even your modest parish sets rules about where to dig and when to ring. A system exists. It creaks. It tries. The most honest measure of your job is the wear on your spade. You resharpen the blade. You mend the shaft. You know how many times a handle can be replaced before you are basically holding the ship of Theseus. You name the spade in your head sometimes, quietly, the way you would name an ox. You do not say it aloud because that would invite commentary, and you are not in the mood. You work better with allies, even if they are wooden. There are stories that do not belong to you, yet you carry them across the yard. The mother who kisses a shroud before the last prayers. The old man who asks for one more bell and presses a coin into your hand, then thanks you with that cracked kind of gratitude that feels heavier than gold. The priest who loses his voice because he does the office of the dead 6 times in a day. The boy who grows up to take your spade because you cannot lift it anymore. These are not fictions. These are the ordinary results of a job done in every town in Christendom. You are a professional in a time period that pretends most things are ordained rather than managed. Your industry stays partially invisible because it is considered unseemly to think about this too much. The art placed around death is deliberate. Candles, palm, incense, painted saints. The mechanics underneath that art are you. A good burial is part emotion, part liturgy, part geometry, and entirely manual labor. Walk out of the yard at dusk. The yew trees hold shadows like secrets. The ground under your feet lifts in places where people have rested for decades. The church wall is warmer than the air. Behind it, a charnel room stacked respectfully with bones, looks like order and feels like a lesson. A skull grins because that is what skulls do. You grin back because you have a black sense of humor that keeps you sane. You are not a villain. You are not a saint. You are a person with a shovel in a century with too many dead. Your job is hard. Your days are precise and grim, and sometimes strangely tender. More myths knock on the door, and you bolt it with facts. Quicklime is not a medieval acid bath. 6 feet under is a later rule. Beak masks are a later aesthetic. Grave goods for you to steal are rare, because Christians bury mostly without them. Mass graves at East Smithfield were not chaotic dumps. The dead were laid with a kind of care that speed allowed. Warren Percy's bones show that fear of revenants could push communities into unusual rituals. Hythe and Rothwell prove that bones had afterlives in architecture. The worshipful company of parish clerks existed to coordinate men like you in London by the 1440s. The Statute of Labourers of 1351 tried to sit on wages and failed as often as it succeeded. The Ordinances of Pistoia in 1348 are the medieval version of a pandemic policy memo with candles. Boccaccio is not lying when he says that bodies moved by the cartload. Agnolo Daitura is not embellishing when he says he buried his children. These are the pieces of your world assembled with citations. Your shoes finally fall apart. Your knees have opinions. Your hands are carved out of work. The bell will ring again tomorrow. You will get up and do it again, because people keep dying, and the parish keeps counting, and salvation in your world includes a body placed in a specific way in a particular kind of soil, with words said in the right order. That is your craft. That is your grind. That is why it sucks to be you, and why you do it anyway. The past is a job. You show up. You dig. You do not linger. A line of people waits outside the church gate. You let them in and keep the system moving. The irony never lets go. People think of medieval death as theatre with costumes. You think of it as geometry plus endurance. The art and the stink. The Latin and the mud. The saints and the splinters. You make peace with that, or you break. Most days you make peace. Some nights you do not. When a new law arrives to regulate your work, you adapt, and you mutter, and then you adapt again. The grave remains the same shape. The spade remains the same friend. The bell remains honest. You step home, under a sky full of nothing but stars and smoke. The town quiets down because even gossip goes to bed eventually. You fall onto a straw bed that smells like your day. In another century, somebody will glamorize your job or reduce it to a punchline. You give them the only correction that matters, buried in the ground itself. This was brutal, necessary, unromantic work, and it kept a whole society's promises at minimum wage plus ale. Your signature is in the soil. Your archive is in the charnel. Your review is in the silence after the last clod drops. The bell stops. For now, the spade waits by the door.